Imagine standing at the edge of a Scottish loch on a morning when the mist clings to the water like a shroud. The surface is glass, perfectly still, reflecting the grey sky above with such precision that you cannot tell where the world ends and its reflection begins. This is not merely a body of water, this is a threshold, a place where the boundary between the visible world and the unseen realm grows dangerously thin, as fragile as the silk of a spider's web stretched across the void. And beneath that deceptive stillness, something ancient waits, with the patience of stone and the hunger of a predator that has never known mercy. The Highlands and Islands of Scotland are home to legends that have survived centuries, passed down through generations in whispered warnings around peat fires, and in the careful instructions parents gave their children before they ventured near water. Among these legends, one creature stands apart, not for its fame, but for its lethality. The Each-Uisge, pronounced Each-Uisge, is not the water horse you may have heard of in romantic retellings or children's tales. It is something far more terrible, far more cunning, and infinitely more deadly than its better-known cousin, the Kelpie. Where the Kelpie haunts rivers and streams, the Each-Uisge claims dominion over the deep lochs and the cold embrace of the sea itself, territories from which there is no escape once its trap has been sprung. Before we descend into the depths of this legend, before we trace the adhesive horror of its skin and the cold intelligence behind its beautiful disguise, I want to invite you to join our growing community here at Echoes of the Old World. We journey together into the forgotten corners of mythology, the stories that shaped cultures and encoded survival wisdom in narrative form. If these explorations into the liminal spaces between history and legend speak to you, subscribe now and become part of this journey. We have much more darkness to illuminate together. And before we continue deeper into the Each-Uisge's realm, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from and whether the waters near you carry their own legends, their own warnings whispered from one generation to the next. Are you watching from the Highlands themselves, where these stories were born? From distant shores, where different water spirits claim their victims? Or from landlocked places, where such tales seem impossibly remote? Your perspective matters, and I read every comment. The Each-Uisge is not a monster born of superstition or ignorance. It is the personification of a very real danger, the encapsulation of every drowning, every disappearance, every life claimed by deep water in communities where survival depended on respecting the boundaries between the human world and the elemental forces that surrounded it. In the oral traditions of the Highlands, in the carefully preserved accounts collected by folklorists and cultural historians, the Each-Uisge emerges not as a simple beast, but as an entity of profound and terrifying intelligence. It understands human desire. It weaponizes beauty. It exploits the very qualities that make us human: our longing for freedom, our attraction to the magnificent, our fatal hesitation in the face of something too perfect to be true. This creature appears most commonly as a horse of such extraordinary beauty that encountering it seems like a gift from fortune itself. Its coat gleams with impossible luster, its form is powerful and perfectly proportioned, and it stands waiting, seemingly gentle, at the water's edge or grazing near the shore. Every detail is calibrated to inspire trust, to awaken the desire to approach, to touch, and ultimately, to mount. But the Each-Uisge's beauty is not a blessing. It is a weapon honed over centuries of successful predation, and the moment human skin makes contact with its hide, the trap snaps shut with absolute finality. The skin of the Each-Uisge possesses a supernatural adhesive quality that folklore describes with chilling consistency across different accounts and regions. Once you touch it, you cannot pull away. Once you mount it, you are fused to its back as surely as if your flesh had melted into its own. There is no struggle that will free you, no strength sufficient to break the bond. The Each-Uisge feels your panic, registers your terror with cold awareness, and then it moves with terrible purpose toward the water. Not rushing, for there is no need. You are already claimed. The outcome is certain. What follows is a descent into darkness, both literal and absolute. The Each-Uisge drags its victim into the deepest parts of the loch, or out into the open sea, far beyond any hope of rescue or intervention. The drowning is conscious, prolonged, and utterly without mercy. And when the creature has pulled you down into the crushing depths where light cannot penetrate, it begins to feed. The Each-Uisge devours every part of its victim with methodical thoroughness, consuming flesh and bone and organ, leaving nothing intact, nothing recognizable, nothing, that is, except for one grim calling card that floats to the surface hours or days later, a final message to those who wait on shore. The liver, and only the liver, is rejected by the Each-Uisge, rising through the dark water to break the surface like a terrible punctuation mark at the end of a life. This is where our journey begins, at the edge of waters that have claimed countless lives, in the territory of a predator that has never been conquered, never been tamed, and never been forgotten by those who understood that survival in the Highlands required more than strength or courage. It required knowledge, respect for the rules of the invisible world, and the wisdom to recognize when something beautiful was, in truth, death wearing an irresistible mask. The Each-Uisge waits still in the deep places, patient as stone, hungry as the void, and we are about to discover why Highland tradition named it the most dangerous water spirit ever to haunt the British Isles. There is power in naming. In the Gaelic-speaking communities of the Scottish Highlands and Islands, this was not merely a philosophical concept, but a lived truth that governed how people spoke, what they acknowledged, and what they left carefully unspoken. To name something was to give it presence, to invite it into the space between speaker and listener, to acknowledge its reality in a way that carried consequences. And there were certain names that carried more weight than others. Names that parents taught their children to speak with caution, or in some cases, not to speak at all when standing near deep water as twilight fell. The Each-Uisge. Even now, centuries after the height of belief, the name retains a certain heaviness on the tongue. In Scottish Gaelic, it translates most directly as water horse, with each meaning horse and uisge meaning water. But this simple translation fails to capture the layers of meaning embedded in those syllables. The way the name itself functioned as both identification and warning. The pronunciation, Each-Uisge, with its guttural opening and the liquid flow of the second word, mimics the sound of water itself. The harsh breath, followed by the whisper of waves or the movement of currents beneath a deceptively calm surface. To speak the name correctly was to demonstrate that you belonged to a community that knew, that remembered, that had not forgotten the lessons written in disappeared lives. Across the Highlands and throughout the islands, the Each-Uisge was known by variations that reflected regional dialects and local emphasis, but the core remained consistent. In some areas, it was called the Agiski or the Shupilti, names that carried the same essential meaning, but with pronunciation shaped by the specific cadences of Island Gaelic or the particular accent of a coastal village. These variations were not merely linguistic curiosities. They were evidence of how widespread the belief was, how deeply it had woven itself into the fabric of Scottish culture across geographical barriers and isolated communities. From the Outer Hebrides to the deep glens of the Central Highlands, from Shetland in the far north to the sea lochs of the west coast, the Each-Uisge was known, feared, and spoken of in tones that conveyed absolute seriousness. The weight that the name carried in traditional Highland society cannot be overstated. This was not a monster from a story told to entertain. It was not a legend recounted with the comfortable distance of disbelief or the playful thrill of fictional horror. The Each-Uisge was spoken of in the same register as drowning itself, as hypothermia, as the very real and documented dangers that claimed lives in communities where water was both sustenance and threat. Elders who taught children about the Each-Uisge were not sharing folklore in the modern sense. They were transmitting survival knowledge encoded in narrative form, using the creature's name as a mnemonic device that would lodge itself in memory and surface as caution when a child saw a beautiful horse standing alone near the shore. In the oral tradition, the act of naming the Each-Uisge was often accompanied by specific gestures or contextual markers that reinforced its reality. A storyteller might lower their voice when speaking the name, creating an atmosphere of reverence or dread that signaled to listeners that this was not entertainment but education. Parents warning their children about water safety would invoke the Each-Uisge by name, using it as shorthand for all the ways that lochs and seas could seduce and destroy. The name became a tool, a way of compressing complex warnings about adhesion, about the inability to escape once trapped, about the intelligence and patience of predators, into 2 words that a child could remember and carry into adulthood. The linguistic structure of the name itself reveals something about how Highland culture understood this entity. The word each, horse, places the creature firmly in a category of beings that were familiar, useful, and valued in daily life. Horses were transportation, labour, wealth, and companionship in Highland society. They were not exotic or alien, but deeply integrated into human activity. By naming this water predator a horse, the language acknowledges the creature's most effective weapon, its ability to appear as something desirable rather than threatening, something that invited approach rather than flight. The addition of uisge, water, transforms the familiar into the lethal, signaling that this is a horse that belongs to a different realm, one governed by rules that contradict everything safe and known about the animals that humans had domesticated. But the name also functioned as a boundary marker in another sense. To know the proper name, to pronounce it correctly, was to demonstrate membership in a community that held specific knowledge. Outsiders might hear the stories and dismiss them as superstition or colourful local belief. But those who had grown up hearing the name spoken with gravity, who had internalized the warnings attached to it, understood that the Each-Uisge represented a cultural consensus about danger that had been tested and confirmed across generations. The name was not arbitrary or invented for effect. It was the crystallization of accumulated experience, the linguistic vessel that carried the memory of every victim whose liver had floated to the surface. Every family that had lost a child to the adhesive horror of beautiful skin. In some communities, there were protocols around speaking the name aloud near water, particularly at dusk or dawn when the boundary between worlds grew most permeable. To name the Each-Uisge in such liminal spaces and times was considered an invitation, a way of drawing attention that was profoundly unwise. This practical taboo reinforced the creature's reality in the minds of believers. If something required such careful handling in speech, if its name alone could carry risk, then it was not merely a story, but an active presence in the world, something that could hear and respond and arrive with terrible purpose. The name endures today, preserved in written collections of folklore, in academic studies of Scottish mythology, and in the continuing oral traditions of those who maintain connection to Highland culture. But something has been lost in the transition from lived belief to cultural heritage. The name Each-Uisge no longer carries the weight it once did, no longer stops children in their tracks, or makes adults glance nervously at still water. Yet for those who study these traditions seriously, who seek to understand rather than simply catalogue, the name still whispers its warning across the centuries. Each-Uisge, waterhorse, beauty that binds, death that waits beneath the mirror surface of Highland lochs. Territory defines predators. A wolf claims the forest, a shark patrols the reef, and each knows the boundaries of its hunting ground with intimate precision. In the supernatural landscape of Scottish folklore, territorial distinctions were equally crucial, and understanding them could mean the difference between life and death. The Each-Uisge and the Kelpie, though often confused by those unfamiliar with Highland tradition, occupied fundamentally different domains, and this geographical separation was not merely a detail of classification. It was the key to understanding why the Each-Uisge was considered infinitely more dangerous, why its name carried greater dread, and why the chances of survival once encountered dropped to nearly zero. The Kelpie, the more widely known of Scotland's waterhorses, is a creature of flowing water, of rivers and streams where current provides both hunting advantage and escape route for the observant. Rivers have shores within reach, shallows where a person might gain footing, and the eternal movement of water that prevents perfect concealment. A Kelpie might lurk near a ford or rest beside a shallow crossing, but its domain is defined by banks and breadth, by water that moves in one direction and eventually leads somewhere. This limitation, if it can be called that, created small margins for escape in the folklore. Stories exist of individuals who recognized the Kelpie's true before mounting, who fled to the safety of distance, or who in rare cases were rescued by intervention before being dragged too far downstream. The Each-Uisge acknowledges no such limitations. Its territory is the deep loch, where the bottom drops away into darkness that has never known sunlight, where the cold is absolute and the pressure can crush a human body like paper. Its territory is the open sea, where land becomes a distant memory and the water extends in every direction to the horizon and beyond. These are not waters with convenient shores or rescuers within shouting distance. These are waters that swallow completely, that erase, that offer no second chances to those who miscalculate or fail to recognize danger before it is too late. When the Each-Uisge positions itself near the edge of a Highland loch or along a coastal shore, it does so with the confidence of a predator that has never needed to hurry, because there is nowhere for its prey to go once the trap is sprung. Consider the psychological difference between these hunting grounds. A river, no matter how swift or deep, retains a sense of progression, of connection between one place and another. It flows from the mountains to the sea, passing through human territory, visible and mappable. But a loch is a contained world unto itself, a pocket of water surrounded by land, yet utterly separate from it. The surface of a loch can be mirror still, revealing nothing of the depth beneath, hiding the true dimensions of the void that waits below. Scottish lochs are not shallow ponds or decorative lakes. They are profound chasms filled with water, some descending to depths of over 700 feet, containing volumes of liquid darkness sufficient to hide entire landscapes within their cold embrace. The Each-Uisge understood this geography with the same instinctive certainty that a spider understands the architecture of its web. It positioned itself where the depth was greatest, where one step from shore would take a person from safety into water over their head, with no gradual transition. It waited near those lochs known for sudden drop-offs, where the comfortable shallows ended abruptly and the bottom fell away into nothing. And when it appeared on coastal shores, it chose locations where the tide could carry a struggling victim out to sea with methodical inevitability, where the land would recede with every passing moment until it became a line on the horizon, then a memory, then nothing at all. This territorial preference was not random or aesthetic. It was tactical. The Each-Uisge was a creature of profound intelligence, and every choice it made served the singular purpose of successful predation. In deep water, there are no branches to grab, no rocks to climb upon, no shallow refuges where exhausted swimmers can rest. There is only the vertical dimension, the descent into darkness, and the slow, crushing awareness that the surface is moving farther away with every second. The Each-Uisge did not need to fight its victims or overcome resistance. It simply needed to wait until the water itself became the weapon, until cold and depth and the absence of air did the work that teeth and claws might accomplish in other predators. The sea-dwelling aspect of the Each-Uisge added another layer of terror to its legend. While some Highland lochs were remote enough that people could avoid them entirely, the sea was unavoidable for island and coastal communities. It was the highway, the food source, the boundary of the known world. Fishermen, travelers, those gathering kelp or checking crab pots, all had to interact with saltwater as a matter of survival. And the Each-Uisge, according to tradition, was equally at home in these tidal waters, as in the still depths of inland lochs. It could appear on a beach where children played, near a harbour where boats were moored, along any stretch of coastline where the water was deep enough to serve its purposes. This ubiquity meant that vigilance could never relax, that every beautiful horse encountered near water demanded suspicion, and that the geography of safety became impossibly complex. Highland communities developed their knowledge of dangerous waters through bitter experience. Certain lochs acquired reputations, their names spoken with the same caution as the Each-Uisge itself. These were not arbitrary designations, but accumulated wisdom, the mapping of tragedy onto landscape. A loch where children had disappeared became a loch where children were forbidden to play alone. A coastal inlet where a beautiful horse had been sighted became a place to avoid at dusk. The geography of the Each-Uisge's territory was written in loss, each marker a life that had taught the living where danger concentrated. This is why the Each-Uisge was never tamed, never bargained with, never incorporated into the human world the way some supernatural entities were through ritual or offering. Its territory was fundamentally incompatible with human survival. The deep loch and the open sea belong to forces that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be made safe, cannot be domesticated. And the Each-Uisge, as the intelligence that inhabited those spaces, was equally implacable, equally beyond the reach of human influence. It ruled the waters of dominion, and those who entered its realm did so at their absolute peril. Beauty is a weapon older than recorded history. It disarms suspicion, invites approach, creates desire where caution should prevail. In the natural world, the anglerfish uses a luminous lure to draw prey into striking distance. The orchid mantis mimics petals to ambush pollinators, and countless predators have evolved the ability to appear harmless or even attractive until the moment of attack. The Each-Uisge understood this principle with a sophistication that transcended mere animal cunning. Its primary form, the shape it wore most often and most effectively, was that of a horse so extraordinarily beautiful that encountering it seemed not like danger, but like fortune, not like a threat, but like an opportunity that would be foolish to refuse. Imagine the form this creature took when it positioned itself for the hunt. The Each-Uisge appeared as a horse of impossible perfection, its coat gleaming with a luster that seemed to capture and amplify whatever light fell upon it. In accounts preserved through oral tradition, Witnesses describe this coat as having an almost liquid quality, like dark water reflecting moonlight, or the deep shimmer of polished jet. The colour varied in different tellings, sometimes appearing as midnight black, sometimes as grey, like storm clouds over the sea, occasionally as white as sea foam, but always with that same uncanny gleam that marked it as something beyond the ordinary. The creature's form was powerful, without being heavy, elegant, without seeming delicate, proportioned with such exact balance that even those who worked with horses daily, who knew every variation of breed and build, would find nothing to criticize and much to admire. The mane and tail were described with particular consistency across regional accounts, always flowing and full, moving as if stirred by a breeze even on perfectly still days. This detail, seemingly minor, served a crucial psychological purpose. Movement draws the eye, suggests life and vitality, creates the impression of a creature in its prime rather than aged or injured. The Each-Uisge's mane would catch what little wind existed, or seem to move of its own accord, giving the impression of restless energy, barely contained, of strength waiting to be released in glorious motion. For a culture that valued horses as transportation, labor, and status symbols, such details spoke directly to desire, awakening the longing to possess, to ride, to claim this magnificent creature as one's own. The eyes were another crucial element of the disguise, and here the folklore reveals the Each-Uisge's deepest cunning. The creature's eyes were almost universally described as large, dark, and impossibly gentle, conveying an impression of docility and trust that contradicted every warning instinct that might have otherwise surfaced. These were not the eyes of a predator, not the cold calculation of a hunter evaluating prey. They were the eyes of a domestic animal, familiar and safe, inviting touch, without threat. Some accounts specified that the Each-Uisge's gaze held a quality of sadness or loneliness, as if the creature were lost or abandoned, appealing to the human impulse toward rescue and care. This emotional manipulation added layers to the trap, engaging not just greed or desire, but compassion, making refusal seem not just foolish, but cruel. The Each-Uisge typically positioned itself in locations calculated to maximize the psychological impact of its appearance. It would stand near the water's edge, but not in it, suggesting a creature that had wandered from elsewhere rather than emerged from the depths. It might appear to be grazing peacefully, head down in the grass, the picture of contentment and harmlessness. Or it would stand perfectly still, as if waiting, as if it had been placed there specifically for the person who discovered it to find. The staging was deliberate, designed to create a narrative in the mind of the viewer, a story in which this beautiful horse was an opportunity, a gift, a stroke of luck, rather than a carefully constructed trap. In a culture where horses represented significant wealth and utility, the appearance of a magnificent horse without obvious ownership created powerful temptation. Highland communities were not wealthy by the standards of lowland Scotland or England. Horses were valuable, often beyond the means of ordinary families to purchase. The sudden availability of such an animal, apparently unclaimed and approachable, would have triggered complex calculations. Who owned it? How had it come to be here? What right did a finder have to claim it all realms? But these rational questions competed with desire, with the practical benefits of suddenly possessing such a creature, with the simple human response to beauty that short-circuits caution and planning. The Each-Uisge exploited every dimension of this psychological vulnerability. Its beauty was not random or generic, but specifically calibrated to appeal to the cultural values and economic realities of Highland life. It appeared strong enough to carry heavy loads or pull a plough, sleek enough to suggest speed for urgent travel, gentle enough to seem manageable even for those without extensive horse-handling experience. The creature offered, in its very form, solutions to real problems that Highland people face daily. Transportation across difficult terrain, labour to ease the burden of survival in harsh landscapes, status and wealth in a society where such things mattered. All of this was encoded in the visual perfection of its appearance, making the trap not just effective, but nearly irresistible. But beneath this carefully constructed beauty lay the true nature of the Each-Uisge, patient and cold and utterly without mercy. The beautiful coat concealed skin with properties that defied nature, that would fuse with human flesh upon contact. The gentle eyes master intelligence that understood exactly how to position itself, exactly what signals to send, exactly how long to wait for the prey to overcome its final hesitations and reach out to touch. The creature's stillness was not the contentment of a grazing animal, but the focused patience of a predator that had learned, across centuries of successful hunts, that hurrying was unnecessary when the trap was built this well. The folklore preserves the memory of countless individuals who saw this beautiful horse standing alone near water and made the fatal choice to approach, to touch, to mount. In every case, the outcome was identical. Beauty had served its purpose, disarming caution and awakening desire. The weapon had found its mark, and the Each-Uisge, patient and perfect in its terrible craft, claimed another victim for the depths. There is a moment in every Each-Uisge encounter when possibility collapses into certainty, when what might have been avoided becomes absolutely inevitable. This moment arrives not with violence or obvious threat, but with a touch, a single point of contact between human skin and the creature's hide. In that instant, which victims described in the rare accounts of witnessed attacks as utterly silent and strangely gentle, the trap achieves its final closure. The beautiful horse that stood so still, that seemed so docile and inviting, reveals the single most terrifying aspect of its skin possesses an adhesive quality that defies every law of the natural world, a supernatural binding that fuses human flesh to the creature's hide with such completeness that separation becomes not difficult, but impossible. The folklore describes this adhesive property with remarkable consistency across different regions and time periods, suggesting that the detail emerged not from creative embellishment, but from observed reality or deeply believed truth. The moment a person's hand touched the Each-Uisge's coat, or their leg made contact when mounting, the skin would adhere with absolute and immediate effect. There was no gradual sticking, no moment of realization followed by time to pull away. The bond was instantaneous and total, as if the victim's flesh had melted into the creature's hide or been absorbed into it at a molecular level. Witnesses who saw this happen from a distance described it as a person suddenly going rigid, their body locked in position as if they had become part of the horse itself, transformed from separate entities into a single grotesque hybrid. This adhesive quality was not merely sticky in the way of tree sap or pitch. Those substances can be overcome with sufficient force, can be dissolved with the right solvents, can be endured until they lose their grip. The Each-Uisge's skin created a bond that was absolute and supernatural, beyond any physical solution or mechanical escape. Victims could not tear themselves free, regardless of strength or desperation. They could not be pulled off by rescuers, no matter how many hands grasped them or how hard the attempt was made. The folklore records instances where multiple people tried to drag a victim away from the Each-Uisge immediately after contact, grasping the person's free limbs and pulling with all their combined strength, only to fail completely. The bond held, the flesh remained fused, and the Each-Uisge, undisturbed by these efforts, simply waited for the struggling to exhaust itself. The psychological horror of this adhesive trap cannot be overstated. Imagine the progression of understanding in those final seconds of freedom. You reach out to touch the beautiful horse, perhaps to stroke its neck or test its temperament before mounting. Your palm makes contact with the gleaming coat, and in that instant, you cannot pull back. Your hand is no longer yours to control. It is part of the creature now, bonded so completely that you cannot tell where your skin ends and the horse's hide begins. You try to jerk away, and nothing happens. Your arm strains, muscles screaming with effort, but your hand remains perfectly still, perfectly attached, as if it had grown from the creature's body rather than your own. The panic that follows is immediate and absolute, the realization that you have crossed a threshold from which there is no return. For those who mounted the Each-Uisge before understanding the adhesion was even more comprehensive and therefore more terrifying. Their legs would fuse to the creature's sides, their hands to its mane or neck if they grasped for balance, their entire lower body becoming inseparably joined to the horse's back. They could still move their upper body, could scream and flail their arms, could twist and writhe in futile attempts to free themselves, but below the waist they were locked in position as surely as if they had been carved from the same piece of stone. Some accounts describe victims trying to throw themselves backward off the horse, arching their spines and pushing with their arms, only to discover that their legs would not release, that they remained seated no matter how violently they moved. The Each-Uisge itself showed no reaction to these struggles. It did not rear or buck, did not need to fight to maintain its hold on the victim. The adhesive skin did all the work of restraint, and the creature simply stood still, patient as always, waiting for the panic to exhaust itself into resignation, or continued long enough that the victim no longer had the strength to resist what came next. In some tellings, witnesses describe the horse turning its head to look at its captured prey with those same gentle, dark eyes that had made the trap so effective in the first place, as if acknowledging the completion of a hunt well executed. The supernatural of this adhesion was understood by Highland communities to be absolute and without remedy. There was no trick or tool that could break the bond, no prayer or counterspell that could dissolve the connection. Iron, which held power over many supernatural entities in Celtic folklore, had no effect on the Each-Uisge's adhesive skin. Holy water, protective symbols, desperate promises or bargains, all were equally useless once contact had been made. The creature's trap was perfectly designed, admitting no loopholes or weaknesses that might allow escape. This completeness reinforced the central message of Each-Uisge lore, that certain boundaries must never be crossed, that some risks cannot be taken even once, because there are no second chances when dealing with entities that exist beyond human law or natural limitation. The adhesive skin also explains why Each-Uisge attacks always ended in death. Unlike encounters with other dangerous animals, or even other supernatural entities, where luck or intervention might occasionally allow escape, the Each-Uisge admitted no possibility of survival once the contact occurred. The victim was bound. The creature had all the time it needed. And what followed the adhesion, the slow journey into deep water, and the methodical consumption that waited at the end, was as inevitable as dawn following darkness. The adhesive curse was not merely a feature of the Each-Uisge's hunting method. It was the guarantee of the hunt's success, the element that transformed a dangerous encounter into a certain death sentence, and the detail that separated this creature from every other water spirit in the folklore of the British Isles. Once the adhesive bond had formed, once the victim was locked to the Each-Uisge's body with no possibility of escape, the creature's patience transformed into purposeful motion. There was no hurry in its movement, no rush or urgency that might suggest doubt or concern. The Each-Uisge simply turned toward the water with the steady deliberation of an entity that had performed this exact sequence countless times before and knew with absolute certainty how it would end. The victim, still struggling, or perhaps frozen in shock, could do nothing but experience what followed. Their feet would lift from solid ground as the creature moved forward, and in that moment they crossed from the realm of earth and air into the territory where the Each-Uisge held complete dominion. The initial entry into the water was described in surviving accounts with a detail that suggests witnesses watched from shore, helpless to intervene. The Each-Uisge would walk into the loch or sea with the same calm gait it had displayed on land, its hooves finding purchase on the submerged stones or sand, as if weight and physics still applied in conventional ways. The water would rise around the victim's legs first, cold beyond anything they had experienced. The shocking temperature of Highland lochs, where summer warmth never penetrates beyond the surface layer. Then it would reach their waist, their chest, and finally their shoulders, as the creature continued forward without pause, submerging both itself and its captured prey beneath the surface in a descent that allowed for consciousness, for full awareness of every stage of what was happening. The Each-Uisge did not dive or plunge. It walked into the depths with the same steady progression it had used on land, allowing the water to close over victim and creature in stages that prolonged the experience and eliminated any merciful quickness. The victim could still breathe at first, could gasp and scream until the water reached their chin, could take one final desperate breath before the surface passed over their head. And then came the submersion, the moment when air became memory and water became environment, when every instinct screamed to surface, but the adhesive bond held them in place, locked to a creature that showed no intention of returning to the breathable world above. The descent continued beyond the depth where light penetrates, beyond the zone where human bodies can survive without crushing injury, into the absolute darkness of the loch floor or the open water far from any shore. The pressure would build gradually, squeezing the victim's chest and skull, making each attempt to hold what remained of that final breath an agony of its own. Their lungs would burn with increasing desperation, the carbon dioxide building in their blood and triggering every panic response evolution had encoded in the human nervous system. But there was nowhere to go, no surface to reach, no rescue possible in depths where other humans could not follow, even if they had known exactly where to search. The Each-Uisge's intelligence was evident in its choice of drowning location. It did not simply submerge its victim in shallow water, where the body might be quickly recovered or where the struggle might be visible from shore. It took them deep into the cold layers where decomposition slowed and where the darkness was total and eternal. In the sea, it might drag them far from the coast, out into water where the bottom dropped away to hundreds or thousands of feet, where currents would scatter any remains and make recovery impossible. In lochs, it sought the deepest trenches, the places where the glaciers had carved their most profound channels into the bedrock, creating underwater canyons where human artifacts and bodies could rest undisturbed for centuries. The victim's consciousness would persist longer than mercy might allow. The human body does not surrender immediately to drowning, does not grant the relief of instant unconsciousness when deprived of air. There are seconds, perhaps minutes, of full awareness as the oxygen in the bloodstream depletes, as the involuntary gasping reflex finally overcomes the will to keep the mouth closed, as water floods into the lungs and the burning sensation transforms into something worse. The Each-Uisge's victims experienced all of this while still bonded to the creature's body, still unable to move or fight or exercise any agency over their fate. They died slowly, consciously, in absolute darkness and cold, crushed by pressure and drowned by water and utterly alone, despite being physically attached to the entity that had orchestrated their death. Witness accounts from shore describe the surface disturbance during an Each-Uisge attack as surprisingly minimal. There might be splashing as the creature entered the water, perhaps some thrashing if the victim still had free limbs. But once submersion was complete, the Loch Awe would return to its previous calm with disturbing speed. The mirror-still surface would show no sign of the horror unfolding in the depths below. No indication that a human being was dying in the crushing darkness, just yards or feet beneath the deceptive tranquility. This visual disconnect between surface calm and underwater violence served to reinforce the Each-Uisge's mythological power, demonstrating that the creature operated in a dimension hidden from ordinary sight, accessible only to those who violated the boundaries that should never be crossed. The drowning pull was not merely a method of killing, but a demonstration of the Each-Uisge's fundamental nature as a creature of the deep places, an entity that belonged to water in ways that humans could never achieve. It was comfortable in environments that would kill a person in minutes, could navigate in absolute darkness without hesitation, and possessed the patience to drag its victim as far as necessary to ensure the kill was complete. The creature did not need to bite or tear to destroy life. It simply needed to take a person into its own element and wait for the water itself to do the work of death. And when the drowning was finished, when the victim's struggles had ceased and the body hung limp against the adhesive skin, the Each-Uisge would finally release its hold and begin the methodical consumption that represented the final horror in a sequence of horrors, the culmination of a hunt that had been perfectly executed from the moment the beautiful horse first appeared near the water's edge. In the crushing darkness of the loch floor or the deep sea, far from any witness and beyond the reach of light or rescue, the Each-Uisge would finally release the adhesive bond that had held its victim captive. The supernatural connection that had made escape impossible would dissolve as abruptly as it had formed, allowing the drowned body to drift free in the cold water. But this release was not an act of mercy or the conclusion of the hunt. It was merely the transition from capture to consumption, the moment when the Each-Uisge began the feeding ritual that represented the culmination of its predatory cycle and the source of the most disturbing detail in all of Highland water spirit lore. The Each-Uisge's method of consumption was described with horrifying consistency across different regions and time periods, suggesting that this was not embellishment or variation, but a core element of the creatures that remained constant regardless of where the attack occurred. The creature devoured its victim with methodical thoroughness, consuming flesh and bone and organ with an efficiency that left almost nothing intact. It ate the arms and legs, stripping them to nothing. It consumed the torso, the ribs, the spine, every structure that gave the human body its shape and function. It devoured the heart and lungs, the stomach and intestines, the kidneys and brain, every internal organ that sustained life and processed the experience of being human. The feeding was complete and systematic, transforming a person from a living individual into nothing more than fuel for a supernatural predator's appetite. But there was one exception to this thoroughness, one organ that the Each-Uisge consistently refused to consume, and this detail became the creature's signature, the grim calling card that allowed Highland communities to identify when an Each-Uisge had claimed another victim. The liver, and only the liver, was left untouched by the creature's feast. After consuming everything else, after reducing a human being to scattered fragments in the deep water, the Each-Uisge would leave the liver intact, allowing it to float free from the feeding site and begin its slow journey toward the surface. This rejected organ would rise through the dark water, buoyant and resistant to the pressures that crushed other tissues, eventually breaking the surface of the loch or appearing on the shore days or weeks after the disappearance had been reported. The the folklore does not provide a clear explanation for why the liver was specifically rejected. Some traditions suggested that the Each-Uisge found this organ distasteful or indigestible, that there was some quality to liver tissue that even a supernatural predator could not or would not consume. Others proposed that the rejection was deliberate, a message from the creature to the living, a way of confirming that another victim had been taken and consumed according to the ancient pattern. The liver floating to the surface served as proof of death when no body would ever be recovered, as closure for families who might otherwise spend years wondering if their missing loved one might somehow return. It was a terrible kindness, if such a phrase can be applied to the actions of a predator, providing certainty where ambiguity might have been more merciful. The appearance of a liver on the surface of a loch or washing up on a beach was treated with profound significance in Highland communities. It was not merely evidence of death, but confirmation of the specific manner of dying, proof that the Each-Uisge had been active in those waters and might still be present, waiting for the next victim. The discovery would trigger warnings and renewed vigilance. Parents would strengthen their instructions to children about avoiding certain waters, and the community would mark that location in their mental geography as a place of confirmed danger rather than suspected threat. The floating liver transformed rumour into fact, possibility into documented reality, and reinforced the Each-Uisge's place, not as legend, but as living danger. Witness accounts preserved in oral tradition describe the emotional impact of discovering a victim's liver. Family members who had reported a disappearance days or weeks earlier would finally receive confirmation that their loved one was dead, though the manner of that death provided no comfort. The liver was recognizable as human tissue, but disconnected from any other identifying features. A fragment that confirmed the worst while providing nothing to bury, no body to mourn over, in the traditional ways. This partial evidence, this single organ freed from the darkness, while everything else remained consumed in the depths, created a unique form of grief that Highland culture had to accommodate and process. The biological detail of the liver's buoyancy was understood intuitively by communities that lived close to water and death. The liver, dense with blood vessels and rich in fats, has properties that allow it to resist decomposition longer than many other organs, and to retain enough buoyancy to rise through water column that would hold other tissues in the depths. The Each-Uisge's rejection of this specific organ, whether intentional or instinctive, aligned perfectly with the folklore's function as both warning and explanation. The floating liver became the physical evidence that bridged the gap between supernatural belief and observable reality, the tangible proof that made the Each-Uisge more than a story told to frighten children. In some accounts, there are descriptions of multiple livers appearing on a loch's surface or along a stretch of coastline, evidence of sequential attacks by an Each-Uisge that had established a hunting territory and was feeding regularly in those waters. These clusters of rejected organs would create panic in affected communities, confirming that the danger was not a single incident, but an ongoing threat that required immediate response. The waters where livers were found would be avoided absolutely, marked as territory claimed by a predator that showed no signs of moving on or reducing its activity. The Each-Uisge's feast, concluded by the floating liver, became not just the end of individual lives, but a reshaping of how entire communities interacted with their landscape, what waters they used, and what territories they ceded to the supernatural forces that inhabited the deep places. The liver floating on dark water was the final punctuation in a sentence of death, the last word in a story that had begun with beauty and ended in consumption and the cold certainty that the Each-Uisge's hunger was never truly satisfied. The Each-Uisge's intelligence extended far beyond the cunning, required to position itself effectively as a beautiful horse. The creature possessed a shape-shifting ability that allowed it to shed the equine form entirely and walk among humans in a guise that was, in its own way, even more dangerous than the adhesive horse. The Each-Uisge could take human form, appearing as a man or woman of extraordinary attractiveness, using beauty not merely as lure, but as weapon in a psychological campaign that exploited the deepest human vulnerabilities. Where the horse form targeted greed and opportunity, the human form weaponized loneliness, desire, and the fundamental human need for connection and companionship. The folklore describes the Each-Uisge's human appearance with the same attention to perfection that characterized its equine disguise. When it chose to appear as a man, the creature manifested as someone impossibly handsome, with features that seemed to combine the best aspects of Highland masculinity without any of the rough edges that marked real men who labored in harsh conditions. The Each-Uisge man would be tall and strong, with dark hair that caught the light and eyes that held depth and intelligence. His clothing would be fine, but not ostentatious, suggesting status without intimidation, wealth without arrogance. He would appear near settlements or at gatherings, arriving as a stranger whose origins were vague, but whose presence was immediately magnetic, drawing attention and awakening interest in those who encountered him. When the Each-Uisge took female form, the effect was equally calculated and devastating. She would appear as a woman of stunning beauty, with features that conformed to cultural ideals while maintaining an air of mystery that made her even more intriguing. Her voice would be melodious, her manner gentle but not submissive, her bearing suggesting both accessibility and unattainability in measures designed to maximize fascination. She might appear walking alone near the shore, or sitting by a stream, or encountered by chance on a path near water, always positioned in ways that made the meeting seem like fortune rather than design. The Each-Uisge woman knew exactly how to modulate her responses, when to seem interested, and when to seem hesitant, creating the dynamic tension that makes pursuit feel meaningful rather than easy. The seduction that followed these encounters was patient and psychologically sophisticated. The Each-Uisge in human form did not rush toward the kill with the directness of the horse manifestation. Instead, it engaged in conversation, learned about its target, mirrored their interests and values, and built a connection that felt genuine and reciprocal. The creature might meet the same person multiple times over days or weeks, each encounter deepening the bond and increasing trust, until the target was thoroughly invested emotionally and psychologically. This extended courtship made the eventual betrayal even more complete, transforming what had seemed like meaningful connection into revealed predation. The oral traditions preserve accounts of young women who met handsome strangers near lochs and fell into romances that seemed fated and perfect. The Each-Uisge man would court them with patience and apparent sincerity, speaking of futures together and making promises that address their deepest hopes and fears. He would suggest walks along the shore, moments of privacy away from community oversight, opportunities for intimacy that isolated the target from potential rescue. And when the moment was right, when trust was absolute and the victim had willingly followed the Each-Uisge to the water's edge, the creature would reveal its true, transforming back into the adhesive horse, or simply dragging its victim into the water while maintaining human form, using strength that no real human could possess. Men were equally vulnerable to the Each-Uisge's human disguise, though the dynamics of seduction differed in ways that reflected cultural gender roles and expectations. The Each-Uisge woman would appear to traveling men or those working alone near water, offering companionship that seemed miraculously well-timed. She might claim to be lost or seeking help, or or simply interested in conversation with someone who caught her attention. The loneliness of Highland life, particularly for men working as shepherds or fishermen in isolated locations, made such encounters feel like gifts rather than threats. The Each-Uisge understood this vulnerability with precision, exploiting the hunger for connection that isolation created and using it to lead victims toward water and death. The gendered dimensions of these attacks reveal the Each-Uisge's adaptive intelligence and its deep understanding of human psychology. The creature did not employ a single strategy, but instead tailored its approach based on the target's gender, age, social position, and apparent vulnerabilities. It could be aggressive or passive, bold or shy, commanding or submissive. Whatever role would most effectively lower defenses and create the conditions for successful predation. This flexibility made the Each-Uisge in human even more dangerous than its horse manifestation, because it could pursue victims who would never approach a strange horse, who were too cautious or knowledgeable to fall for that particular trap, but remained vulnerable to emotional manipulation and the promise of human connection. One detail appeared consistently across accounts of the Each-Uisge in human form, a tell that might have saved lives if recognized soon enough. The creature's hair, whether appearing as man or woman, was described as always being slightly damp, with water clinging to the strands, even on dry days, or in locations far from obvious moisture. Some accounts specified that sand or waterweed might be tangled in the hair, or that touching it would reveal a cold, clammy texture that contradicted the warmth suggested by the creature's apparent vitality. This detail connected the human form back to the Each-Uisge's true as a water spirit, a small crack in an otherwise perfect disguise. But recognition required suspicion, and suspicion was precisely what the creature's psychological manipulation was designed to eliminate, making this warning sign visible only in retrospect, after the realization came too late. The human mask represented perhaps the Each-Uisge's most sophisticated predatory adaptation, proof that its intelligence operated on levels that transcended mere animal cunning or even supernatural power. It understood humans well enough to become one convincingly, to mimic not just appearance, but behavior and emotion and social dynamics. And it used this understanding to exploit the very qualities that make us human, our capacity for trust and connection and love, transforming our greatest strengths into vulnerabilities that led inexorably toward cold water and death in the darkness below. Among all the Each-Uisge's transformations, one remained the least documented in folklore, yet perhaps the most strategically significant. The creature possessed the ability to take the form of a giant eagle, a manifestation that extended its hunting range beyond the water's edge and the boundaries of human form, adding a dimension of aerial pursuit that made escape nearly impossible for those who somehow recognized the danger before contact occurred. This avian transformation was mentioned less frequently in oral tradition than the horse or human disguises, not because it was less real, but because those who witnessed it rarely survived to provide detailed accounts, and because the form itself was often glimpsed only in moments of transition or pursuit, when the observer's attention was fragmented by terror. The Each-Uisge's eagle form was described as massive, far larger than any natural bird of prey that inhabited the Highlands or islands. Its wingspan was said to span the width of a small cottage, capable of blocking out the sun when it passed overhead, casting shadows that moved across the landscape with predatory intent. The plumage was typically described as dark, either black like a raven or the deep brown of a golden eagle, but with a sheen that suggested water rather than feathers, as if the creature's fundamental aquatic persisted even in this aerial manifestation. The talons were particularly emphasized in the few surviving descriptions, portrayed as unnaturally long and curved, designed not just to grasp, but to pierce and hold, to carry weight that no natural eagle could manage. The tactical advantages of this form were considerable and revealed the Each-Uisge's adaptive intelligence in their fullest expression. While the horse form required victims to approach and the human form demanded patient social manipulation, the eagle transformation allowed the creature to pursue actively, to chase down those who fled or to access targets that remained safely distant from water. A person who recognized the Each-Uisge in horse form and ran inland, away from the loch or sea, might believe themselves safe, might think that distance from water meant escape from danger. But if the creature chose to take eagle form, that sense of safety would shatter in seconds as massive wings darkened the sky, and talons descended with the speed and precision of a striking hawk. The transformation itself was rarely witnessed in its entirety, but fragments survived in accounts from those who observed the Each-Uisge at the moment of shifting between forms. The process was described as fluid rather than abrupt, the creature's body seeming to flow from one shape to another, like water taking the form of its container. The horse might rear up, and in the space of that motion, its body would elongate and wings would unfold from its sides, the adhesive skin transforming into dark feathers that still retain that characteristic gleam. Or the human form might simply step backward into deeper water and emerge as an eagle rising from the surface with drops streaming from its wings, the transition so smooth that observers questioned whether they had actually seen one entity or two separate creatures. The Each-Uisge used its eagle form for specific tactical purposes that complemented its other hunting methods. When a victim managed to break free from the initial encounter, perhaps recognizing the warning signs before making full contact with the adhesive skin, the eagle form allowed pursuit and recapture. The creature could take to the air and overtake a fleeing person within seconds, descending from above to grasp them in talons that, according to tradition, possess the same adhesive quality as the horse's hide. Once caught in that grip, the victim could not be shaken loose or pulled free, and the eagle would carry them over the land back toward deep water, dropping them into the loch or sea from heights that ensured unconsciousness or injury before submersion. The aerial perspective also granted the Each-Uisge surveillance capabilities that enhanced its effectiveness as a predator. In eagle form, it could patrol vast stretches of coastline or survey multiple lochs from a single vantage point, identifying potential victims and observing their movements and vulnerabilities. It could watch from the sky as travelers approached water, as children played near shores, as isolated individuals created opportunities for attack. This reconnaissance function made the Each-Uisge's subsequent ambushes even more perfectly timed and positioned, because the creature had already studied its targets from above, already understood their patterns and paths, already selected the optimal location and moment for the trap. The eagle form also served psychological functions that reinforced the Each-Uisge's mythological power and the terror it inspired. Eagles were already significant in Highland and Celtic symbolism, associated with power, vision, and the ability to move between earth and sky. By manifesting as a giant eagle, the Each-Uisge appropriated these symbolic associations and twisted them into something predatory and malevolent. The sight of such a creature in the sky became an omen of death rather than a symbol of nobility, a warning that the Each-Uisge was active in the area and hunting with intent. Communities that spotted the giant eagle would increase their vigilance and restrict movement near water, knowing that the creature was not confined to aquatic environments, but could strike from any direction. Some accounts suggested that the Each-Uisge preferred to use its eagle form during certain times or conditions, particularly at dawn and dusk, when light was uncertain and the boundary between day and night created the same liminal quality that made water's edge so dangerous. During these twilight periods, the eagle's dark plumage would blend with shadows, making it difficult to spot until it was already descending, wings spread and talons extended. The creature's approach might be silent or accompanied by a cry that was described as wrong, not quite the call of a natural eagle, but something that carried an edge of intelligence and intent that no animal sound should possess. The eagle transformation represented the Each-Uisge at its most versatile and therefore most dangerous, a predator that could hunt in water, on land, and in the air, that could adapt its form and tactics to whatever the situation demanded. It eliminated the comforting notion that safety could be found in distance from water or avoidance of strange horses. The Each-Uisge could take wing and bring the threat directly to victims who thought themselves beyond reach, demonstrating once again this was not a simple water spirit bound by elemental limitations, but an entity of profound intelligence and adaptability that had evolved countless methods of successful predation across the centuries of its existence. Among the countless Each-Uisge stories preserved in Highland oral tradition, certain accounts stand apart for their specificity, their emotional weight, and the way they were transmitted through generations with careful attention to detail that suggested not embellishment, but witnessed truth. The account from Loch Awe, one of Scotland's longest freshwater lochs, stretching through the heart of Argyll, represents perhaps the most detailed and devastating testimony of an Each-Uisge attack. A story that was recorded by folklorists in the 19th century, but clearly predated their documentation by generations. This was not a vague legend or a cautionary tale shaped by multiple retellings. It was a father's testimony, preserved with the precision that comes from trauma and the desperate need to warn others so that no family would endure what his had suffered. The account begins on an ordinary day in a time when Highland communities lived in intimate proximity to water and the dangers it contained. A father had allowed his children, the exact number varies in different versions, but typically described as 3 or 4, to play near the shore of Loch Awe, while he worked at a distance within sight but not immediate reach. The children ranged in age from very young to adolescent, old enough to have been taught the warnings about water horses, but young enough that the lessons might fade in the presence of something beautiful and seemingly harmless. The father's work, whether tending sheep or repairing stone walls or gathering peat, kept his attention divided between the task at hand and periodic glances toward where his children played along the water's edge. It was during one of these glances that he saw the horse. It appeared suddenly, or perhaps it had been there all along and only now caught his attention, standing at the very edge of the loch where the water lapped against the rocky shore. The father's immediate reaction, preserved in the oral tradition with careful attention to his internal experience, was not alarm but curiosity mixed with concern about ownership. The horse was magnificent, its coat gleaming in the Highland light, and it stood with a stillness that suggested either excellent training or supernatural patience. His children had already noticed the creature and were moving toward it with the inevitable attraction that beautiful animals exert on young minds, their caution forgotten in the face of such an unexpected and wonderful discovery. The father called out to them, his voice carrying across the distance with urgency that the children either did not hear or chose to ignore in their excitement. They were already close to the horse, reaching out to touch it, speaking to it, with the gentle voices children use with animals they hope to befriend. The father began moving toward them, his pace increasing as instinct awakened ahead of conscious understanding, some deep recognition that something was wrong with this picture, that a horse, this fine, should not be standing alone and unclaimed beside a loch known for depth and danger. But the distance between him and his children, which had seemed negligible when he positioned himself for work, now stretched with terrible significance as his legs carried him across uneven ground while his children's hands made contact with the creature's hide. The transformation of the scene happened with shocking speed. One moment, his children were petting a beautiful horse, delighted by their discovery and already imagining the stories they would tell. The next moment, they were screaming, their hands and bodies locked to the creature's skin with an adhesion that defied and reason. The father watched, still running, but knowing with absolute certainty that he would not arrive in time as his children struggled to pull free, and the horse remained perfectly still, perfectly patient, allowing them to understand the completeness of the trap before it began moving toward the water. The younger ones were on the ground, having touched the horse's legs or body, dragged along as it walked. The older child or children had mounted, whether out of boldness or because they thought mounting might somehow help, and now sat frozen in place, fused to the creature's back. The father's testimony, as preserved in the folklore, includes details that suggest he witnessed every stage of what followed with the heightened perception that extreme trauma can produce. He saw the horse enter the water with measured steps, saw the loch rise around his children's bodies as they were dragged or carried into the depths, heard their screams diminish as water reached their faces and then their heads. He describes throwing himself into the water after them, swimming with desperate strength toward where they had submerged, diving repeatedly into the cold darkness until exhaustion forced him to surface. But the loch at that location dropped away to profound depth within feet of the shore, the bottom falling into blackness that daylight never touched, and there was nothing to find in those crushing depths except cold and the absolute absence of his children. The father survived, physically if not wholly in spirit, and returned to shore alone. The community that gathered in response to his cries found him collapsed at the water's edge, speaking in fragments about the beautiful horse and the way his children's hands had stuck to its hide. Details that would have seemed like madness or trauma-induced hallucination, if not for the shared knowledge that such things happened in Highland lochs, that the Each-Uisge was real and patient and eternally hungry. In the days that followed, the father's testimony was confirmed by physical evidence, the grim proof that Highland communities had learned to recognize. The livers floated to the surface one by one, small organs belonging to small bodies, rising through the dark water to confirm that the Each-Uisge had fed according to its ancient pattern. This account from Loch Awe was transmitted through generations with remarkable consistency, preserved not as entertainment, but as testimony, as evidence that demanded to be remembered and respected. The father's story became part of the cautionary literature that parents used to teach their own children about water safety, a real example of real loss that made the Each-Uisge more than legend and elevated vigilance from suggestion to absolute necessity. The specificity of the location, the details of the father's experience, and the confirmation provided by the floating livers combined to create a narrative that resisted dismissal or reinterpretation. A story that insisted on its own truth and demanded that listeners acknowledge the Each-Uisge as present danger rather than historical curiosity. The Isle of Skye, with its dramatic cliffs and isolated glens, its lochs that reflect clouds and mountains in water so still it seems solid, has always been a landscape where the supernatural feels close and credible. Among the many Each-Uisge accounts preserved in Skye's oral tradition, one stands out for its scale of tragedy and the detail with which it was remembered across generations. This is the story of 7 brothers, young men from a single family, who encountered an Each-Uisge on what should have been an ordinary day, and whose fate demonstrated both the creature's lethal efficiency and the slim margin of survival that traditional knowledge could provide when recognized and applied in time. The 7 brothers were traveling together across Skye's interior, moving between settlements on business or family obligation that the surviving accounts do not specify in detail. They were strong young men, the pride of their family and community, capable and confident in ways that youth and numbers can create. The journey took them past one of Skye's many lochs, a body of water that may have been familiar to them, or perhaps was encountered for the first time, though the specific location has been lost or deliberately obscured in the retellings. What remains clear is that they saw a horse standing near the water's edge, a creature of such extraordinary beauty that it stopped their progress and drew their attention with magnetic force. The brothers discussed the horse among themselves, debating its presence and the opportunity it represented. 7 young men meant 7 different perspectives, 7 calculations of risk and reward, 7 voices contributing to the decision that would determine their fates. Some may have been suspicious immediately, recognizing in the horse's perfection something that warranted caution. Others would have seen only the practical advantage of acquiring such an animal, the wealth and status it represented, the utility it could provide to their family. The discussion continued as they approached, drawn forward by curiosity and desire, despite whatever misgivings some among them might have voiced. According to the account preserved in Skye tradition, 6 of the brothers succumbed to the temptation to touch the horse, whether they approached simultaneously or in sequence, whether all were equally eager or some were pressured by others. The result was immediate and catastrophic. Their hands made contact with the gleaming hide, and in that instant they were trapped. Their flesh fused to the creature's body with the supernatural adhesion that defined the Each-Uisge's hunting method. The horse suddenly bore 6 brothers attached to various points on its body, some clinging to its neck or mane, others pressed against its flanks or back, all screaming and struggling as they realized the completeness of their captivity. The 7th brother had held back. Whether this was due to greater caution, slower reaction time, or simply the accident of being positioned at the rear of the group, he alone among the 7 remained free and separate when the trap closed on his brothers. The oral tradition emphasizes this detail with significant weight, suggesting that his survival was not merely luck, but the result of internalized knowledge, an instinctive or learned wariness about beautiful horses near water that made him hesitate when his brothers rushed forward. This moment of hesitation, this fragment of doubt or delay, created the margin between death and survival, proving that traditional knowledge could save lives when applied at exactly the right moment. The 7th brother watched in horror as the Each-Uisge, now bearing 6 trapped victims, turned toward the loch with the same measured patience that characterized all its hunts. His brothers were screaming for help, begging him to pull them free, reaching toward him with whatever limbs remained, unattached to the creature's hide. He tried to grab them, to pull them away from the horse, but the adhesive bond held absolutely. Every attempt to separate his brothers from the creature failed, and with each passing second, the horse moved closer to the water's edge, closer to the depth that would transform capture into drowning, and drowning into consumption. The surviving brother's choice in that moment reveals both the tragedy and the practical wisdom that Highland culture demanded. He could follow his brothers into the water, could attempt rescue in the loch's depths, and almost certainly die alongside them. Or he could survive, could bear witness, could carry the warning back to his community and ensure that his brothers' deaths served the function of protecting others. The oral tradition does not judge this choice harshly. It recognizes that the Each-Uisge admitted no possibility of rescue once the adhesive bond formed, that heroic sacrifice would achieve nothing except additional deaths, and that survival to warn others represented the only meaningful response to witnessed tragedy. The 7th brother watched from the shore as the Each-Uisge entered the loch with his 6 brothers still attached, their cries diminishing as water covered them, then silencing completely as they submerged beneath the surface. The loch returned to its previous calm, showing no sign of the horror that had just unfolded in its depths. the mirror-still surface reflecting clouds and mountains, as if nothing had disturbed its perfect tranquility. The surviving brother remained at the water's edge for hours, perhaps hoping against all reason that his brothers might somehow resurface, perhaps simply paralyzed by shock and grief, unable to accept what he had witnessed or begin the journey back to tell his family that 6 of their sons had been lost to the Each-Uisge. In the days that followed, the physical evidence confirmed what the 7th brother had reported. 6 livers floated to the surface of the loch, each one a confirmation of death and a validation of the survivor's testimony. The community's response was shaped by their understanding of Each-Uisge law. There was no blame assigned to the 7th brother for surviving while his siblings died, no accusation that he should have done more or sacrificed himself alongside them. Instead, his survival was recognized as valuable, his testimony as crucial, and his knowledge of what had happened as a gift to the community that would help prevent future tragedies. The story of the 7 brothers became part of Skye's oral tradition, transmitted with careful attention to the detail that 6 had died and 1 had lived, a narrative that emphasized not just the danger of the Each-Uisge, but the life-saving value of hesitation, of doubt, of that small voice of caution that can mean the difference between becoming a victim and remaining a witness who survives to warn others. The island of North Uist in the Outer Hebrides has preserved a particular category of Each-Uisge story that reveals the creature's psychological sophistication at its most cruel and calculating. These are the accounts where the Each-Uisge employed its human form, not for quick seduction, but for extended courtship, building relationships over time and exploiting the deepest human need for connection and love. The story of the Loch Awe bride represents the most complete and emotionally devastating example of this pattern, a tale that was told and retold in North Uist communities with details that suggest either historical basis or such powerful resonance that it achieved the status of truth regardless of its factual origins. The young woman at the center of this account lived in or near Loch Awe, the main settlement on North Uist's east coast, in a time when the community was small and isolated, when marriages were often arranged and romantic love was a luxury that few could afford to prioritize. She was described, in the oral tradition, as beautiful, but also practical, someone who understood the realities of island life, and did not indulge in fantasies about romantic rescue or perfect unions. Her expectations were modest, shaped by observation of the marriages around her, and the understanding that companionship and mutual respect were the best outcomes most women could hope for in a culture where survival demanded partnership and hard work. The stranger appeared during a time of year when the story does not specify, though the persistence of detail about their multiple meetings suggests spring or summer when travel was easier and outdoor encounters more natural. He arrived in Loch Awe as travelers did, offering no clear explanation for his presence, but also raising no immediate suspicion. He was handsome in the particular way that Each-Uisge accounts consistently describe, with dark hair and eyes that held depth and intelligence, with a physical presence that suggested strength without aggression, with manners that balanced confidence and respect in exactly the proportions that make attraction inevitable. Their first meeting was presented as chance, an encounter near the harbour or along one of the paths that connected the scattered settlements. The stranger spoke to her with courtesy that felt genuine, asked questions that suggested real interest in her answers, and left their first conversation with an impression that stayed with her in the hours and days that followed. He appeared again, and then again, each meeting building on the previous one, creating a pattern of encounters that began to feel less like coincidence and more like courtship, though he never stated his intentions directly or pressed for commitments that might have triggered caution or resistance. The oral tradition emphasizes the duration of this courtship, suggesting weeks or even months of careful relationship building, The Each-Uisge man learned everything about the young woman, her family's circumstances, her hopes and fears, her daily routines, and the small details that revealed her character. He mirrored her values and interests with precision that seemed miraculous, creating the impression of profound compatibility that made her feel understood in ways she had never experienced. He spoke of a future, together, without making specific promises, allowing her imagination to fill in the details, and thereby making her complicit in the fantasy he was constructing. The community began to notice their growing closeness, and reactions varied according to personality and perspective. Some approved, seeing in the stranger a good match for a deserving young woman. Others were more cautious, noting that his origins remained vague, that he seemed to have no family or clear occupation, that there was something about him that did not quite align with the patterns of normal human behavior. But these concerns were dismissed or ignored, particularly by the young woman herself, who had invested too much hope and emotion in the relationship to entertain doubts that might unravel what had become the center of her emotional life. The Each-Uisge man eventually proposed marriage, choosing a moment of particular intimacy and emotional vulnerability to make his offer. The young woman accepted immediately, overwhelmed by joy and relief that her dreams were becoming reality, that she would marry for love rather than convenience, that the stranger who had seemed too good to be true was committing himself to her permanently. Plans were made, the community was informed, and the young woman entered the brief period between engagement and marriage that should have been entirely happy but was marked by small anxieties she could not fully articulate. Doubts that surfaced in quiet moments and were then suppressed as pre-wedding nerves rather than genuine warning signs. The day before the wedding, the Each-Uisge man suggested a walk together, a final opportunity for privacy before they became husband and wife, and their lives merged into the public institution of marriage. The young woman agreed eagerly, seeing in the proposal a romantic gesture that confirmed his devotion and sensitivity. They walked along the coast, following paths that moved gradually away from the settlement and toward more isolated stretches of shoreline where the sea met land in complex arrangements of rock and inlet. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with plans and promises, and the young woman felt a happiness so complete that it seemed to validate every choice she had made and every hope she had nurtured. They reached a particular inlet where the water was deep and clear, where the tide pools reflected sky and the whole scene possessed a beauty that seemed designed for romantic moments. The Each-Uisge man stopped walking and turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw something change, something shift from warmth to coldness, from love to calculation. Before she could process what was happening, before instinct could trigger flight, he revealed his true. The oral tradition varies on whether he transformed into the horse or simply shed the pretense of humanity while maintaining human form, but the result was identical. He grasped her with strength no human could possess and dragged her toward the water, his skin now carrying the adhesive quality that made escape impossible once contact was made. The young woman's screams were heard by fishermen working at a distance, and they rushed toward the sound with whatever speed rough terrain allowed. But by the time they arrived at the inlet, they found only disturbed sand and water already returning to its previous calm. The Each-Uisge had taken her into the sea, had dragged her beneath the surface and into depths from which there could be no rescue. Her body was never recovered, though days later her liver washed up on a beach several miles from where she'd disappeared. The grim confirmation that the Each-Uisge had claimed another victim, and that the beautiful courtship had been nothing more than an elaborate trap, a demonstration of the creature's capacity for patient deception, and the cruel pleasure it took in betraying the trust it had worked so carefully to build. To understand the Each-Uisge's particular horror, we must examine it alongside its more famous relative, the Kelpie, and trace the distinctions that elevated the Each-Uisge from dangerous water spirit to the most lethal supernatural predator in Scottish folklore. Both creatures share the fundamental form of a water horse. Both employ beauty as a weapon, and both claim human victims through drowning and consumption. But these surface similarities obscure profound differences in habitat, behavior, and lethality that Highland tradition recognized and encoded in separate names, separate warnings, and separate levels of dread. The Kelpie and Each-Uisge were cousins in the taxonomy of supernatural entities, but they occupied different ecological niches and posed categorically different levels of threat to human life. The most fundamental distinction lies in territorial domain, a difference that carries cascading implications for every other aspect of how these creatures hunt and kill. The Kelpie is exclusively a creature of flowing water, of rivers and streams where current provides both advantage and limitation. It positions itself near fords and crossing points, places where humans must interact with water as a matter of practical necessity rather than choice. The Kelpie's territory is defined by banks and breadth, by water that moves in predictable directions and maintains consistent depths that can be observed and assessed. Rivers have shallows and deeps, rapids and calms, all visible to those who learn to read water. And this transparency creates opportunities for recognition and escape that simply do not exist in the Each-Uisge's domain. The Each-Uisge, by contrast, claims the deep lochs and the open sea, territories that are fundamentally unknowable and inescapable once entered. A Highland loch can drop from wading depth to hundreds of feet within a single step from shore, the bottom falling away into darkness that has never known light and cold that can stop a heart in minutes. The sea offers even less mercy, extending in all directions to horizons and beyond, with depths that crush and currents that scatter, and temperatures that kill long before drowning completes the work. When the Each-Uisge drags a victim into these waters, there is no shore within reach, no shallow refuge, no possibility of touching bottom or finding purchase. There is only the vertical dimension, the descent into darkness, and the absolute certainty of death. This territorial difference shaped the hunting strategies each creature employed and the success rates they achieved. The Kelpie, working in rivers where escape remained theoretically possible, had to be more aggressive in securing its prey, more violent in its initial attack to prevent flight before the adhesive bond could form. Highland folklore preserves accounts of people who encountered Kelpies and managed to avoid contact, who recognized the warning signs in time and fled to shore or higher ground. Some stories even describe individuals who touched a Kelpie but managed to cut away the adhered flesh, sacrificing skin and muscle to break free before being dragged too far downstream. These escapes, horrific as they were, demonstrate that the Kelpie's hunting method admitted narrow margins for survival. The Each-Uisge required no such aggression because its territory eliminated the possibility of escape regardless of when recognition occurred. Once a victim made contact with the Each-Uisge, whether they realized their mistake immediately or remained ignorant until submersion, the outcome was identical. The creature could afford patience, could allow its prey to understand the completeness of the trap, because the deep loch or open sea guaranteed that struggle would exhaust itself long before reaching safety. This fundamental security in its hunting grounds allowed the Each-Uisge to employ more sophisticated strategies, to build elaborate traps using human form and extended courtship, knowing that when the moment of revelation came, the victim's awareness of danger would change nothing about their fate. The adhesive quality of the skin appeared in both creatures. but folklore suggests differences in intensity or permanence that reflected their different hunting pressures. Kelpie adhesion, while terrible and often fatal, was sometimes described as breakable through extreme measures, through cutting away flesh or applying substances that might dissolve the bond. The Each-Uisge's adhesion was presented as absolutely inviolable, beyond any physical or supernatural remedy. A trap that once sprung could never be opened. This difference, whether real or simply a reflection of different survival rates, reinforced the Each-Uisge's reputation as the more dangerous entity, the predator whose trap admitted no weaknesses or loopholes. The consumption patterns differed in subtle but significant ways. Kelpies were said to devour their victims completely in some accounts, to leave recognizable remains in others, the variation suggesting either different Kelpie individuals with different preferences, or simply inconsistency in oral tradition across regions. The Each-Uisge's feeding ritual, by contrast, was described with remarkable consistency across all accounts and locations. It consumed everything except the liver, which floated to the surface as the creature's signature, its calling card, its confirmation of identity. This consistency suggests either a deeply ingrained behavioral pattern or a detail so important to the Each-Uisge's cultural function that it resisted variation even across centuries of retelling. Highland communities developed different response strategies for each creature, reflecting their understanding of the distinct threats each posed. Kelpie warnings focused on teaching people to recognize the signs before contact occurred, to read the water for reversed hoofprints, to notice the waterweed in the main, to maintain suspicion of lone horses near rivers. These were practical survival strategies built on the premise that avoidance was possible if one remained alert and knowledgeable. Each-Uisge warnings carried a different emphasis. They focused less on recognition and more on absolute prohibition, on never approaching beautiful horses near deep water regardless of circumstance, on treating certain lochs and coastal areas as fundamentally dangerous territories to be avoided entirely rather than navigated carefully. The folklore also suggests that Kelpies were more common, or at least more frequently encountered, than Each-Uisge. Rivers are numerous and cross inhabited areas regularly, creating many opportunities for Kelpie-human interaction. Deep lochs and suitable coastal areas, while widespread in the Highlands and islands, were less densely distributed and could be avoided more easily by those who knew the geography. This difference in encounter frequency may have contributed to the Each-Uisge's more fearsome reputation. The creature that kills, rarely but with absolute certainty, often inspires greater dread than the one that kills frequently, but with occasional failures, because the rare predator's success rate suggests capabilities beyond mere animal cunning or supernatural power. The ultimate distinction between Kelpie and Each-Uisge lies not in their methods, but in the certainty of outcome. Both were deadly. Both claimed many lives, but only the Each-Uisge was considered absolutely lethal, a predator whose successful hunts approached 100%, whose victims had no hope of escape once the trap closed. This is why Highland tradition reserved its deepest dread for the Each-Uisge, why its name carried more weight than the Kelpies, and why it earned recognition as the most dangerous water spirit ever to inhabit the cold lochs and dark seas of Scotland. The Each-Uisge's presence in Highland and island geography was not uniform or random, but concentrated in specific locations that acquired reputations through accumulated tragedy and carefully preserved oral tradition. These were not arbitrary designations, but the product of generations of observation, loss, and the painstaking work of mapping danger onto landscape so that knowledge could be transmitted and lives could be saved. The geography of fear that Highland communities created around Each-Uisge territory represented one of folklore's most practical functions. transforming abstract warnings into concrete spatial knowledge that could be learned, remembered, and applied in daily life. To understand the Each-Uisge fully, we must understand where it hunted and why certain waters earned reputations that persisted across centuries. Loch Awe, stretching over 25 miles through the heart of Argyll, held a particularly dark reputation in Each-Uisge lore. Its length and depth, combined with the isolation of much of its shoreline, created ideal hunting conditions for a predator that required deep water and limited witnesses. The loch's complexity, with numerous bays and inlets where a creature could position itself unseen until the perfect moment, made it a landscape of constant potential danger rather than isolated the threat points. Some communities around Loch Awe developed specific knowledge about which sections of shoreline were most dangerous, which bays had claimed victims, and which times of day or year seemed to correlate with increased Each-Uisge activity. This localized knowledge was transmitted from parents to children with the same seriousness as other survival skills, embedding geographic awareness of supernatural danger into the basic education required for Highland life. The lochs of Skye, particularly those in the island's remote interior, carried their own layers of accumulated dread. These were waters surrounded by mountains and accessible only through difficult terrain, places where help was distant and isolation absolute. The combination of physical remoteness and supernatural danger created zones that were avoided when possible and traversed with extreme caution when avoidance was impossible. Certain lochs on Skye were known by names that referenced their danger, though the specific names have been lost or deliberately obscured in the transition from oral to written tradition. What remains is the memory that these waters were feared, that they had claimed lives in ways consistent with Each-Uisge predation, and that local communities treated them with a respect that bordered on religious observance. The Outer Hebrides, particularly the islands of North Uist, South Uist, and Lewis, presented a different geographic challenge, because danger came not just from inland lochs, but from the sea itself. The Each-Uisge's comfort in salt water meant that coastal areas, beaches, and tidal zones all carried potential threat. Communities developed complex knowledge about which stretches of coastline were most dangerous, which inlets and bays seemed to attract Each-Uisge attention, and how tidal patterns might influence the creature's hunting behavior. This coastal dimension of Each-Uisge territory made the geography of fear more pervasive and harder to avoid, because island life demanded regular interaction with the sea for fishing, transportation, and gathering resources. Certain geographic features seem to correlate with increased Each-Uisge danger across multiple locations. Lochs with sudden depth changes, where the bottom dropped away precipitously close to shore, were consistently identified as high-risk territories. The Each-Uisge preferred these locations because they offered immediate access to deep water without requiring the creature to drag victims across shallows where rescue might be attempted. Similarly, lochs surrounded by steep terrain that limited approach. Routes and escape paths created natural kill zones where the Each-Uisge could hunt with minimal risk of interference. These geographic preferences were recognized and encoded in warnings that taught people to exercise particular caution around certain types of water features. The oral tradition also preserved knowledge about seasonal and temporal patterns in Each-Uisge activity. While the creature was understood to be present year-round in its territories, certain times seemed to correlate with increased hunting or greater visibility. Twilight hours, when light was uncertain, and the boundary between day and night created liminal conditions, were considered particularly dangerous times to be near Each-Uisge waters. Some traditions suggested that the creature was more active during certain seasons, though accounts vary on whether spring, summer, or autumn represented peak danger. What remained consistent was the understanding that temporal awareness needed to combine with geographic knowledge to create complete defensive strategy. Highland communities marked Each-Uisge territories through multiple methods that reinforced geographic knowledge across generations. Physical markers, such as cairns or carved stones, might be placed at particularly dangerous locations, serving as permanent reminders even when oral transmission failed or newcomers arrived without proper education. Place names sometimes encoded warnings, though the meanings have often been lost as Gaelic declined and English became dominant. Stories attached to specific locations served as mnemonic devices, making geographic knowledge memorable through narrative structure and emotional resonance. A child who heard the story of the father who lost his children at a particular bay on Loch Awe would remember that location with visceral clarity, the narrative creating a cognitive map of danger that would persist throughout life. The mapping of Each-Uisge territory also had economic and social consequences that shaped how Highland communities developed and interacted with their landscape. Valuable grazing land near dangerous waters might be underutilized or avoided entirely, despite the practical costs this imposed. Settlement patterns sometimes reflected Each-Uisge geography, with communities positioning themselves at safe distances from known danger zones, even when closer proximity to water would have offered advantages. Travel routes were planned to avoid or minimize exposure to Each-Uisge territories, even when this meant longer journeys or more difficult terrain. These spatial adjustments represented the practical application of folklore knowledge, demonstrating that Each-Uisge belief was not merely superstition, but a force that shaped material reality and human behavior in measurable ways. The geography of fear surrounding Each-Uisge territory was not static, but evolved as new attacks occurred, or as changing human activity altered the risk landscape. A loch that had been considered relatively safe might acquire a darker reputation after a disappearance or the discovery of a floating liver. Conversely, waters that had been feared for generations might gradually lose their association with danger if decades passed without incident, though this relaxation of vigilance was itself risky and sometimes led to renewed tragedy that reinforced the original warnings. The dynamic of this geographic knowledge required constant transmission and updating, making Each-Uisge lore a living tradition rather than fixed doctrine, adapting to new evidence while maintaining core understandings about where danger concentrated and why certain waters demanded eternal respect. Survival in Highland and Island communities required more than simple avoidance of dangerous waters. Practical necessity meant that people had to interact with lochs and coastlines regularly for fishing, transportation, gathering resources, and tending livestock that grazed near water. Complete avoidance of Each-Uisge territory was impossible, which meant that communities developed sophisticated knowledge systems for detecting the creature before contact occurred, for reading the signs that distinguished a genuine horse from supernatural predator, and for recognizing danger in time to retreat rather than engage. This detection knowledge was among the most valuable elements of Each-Uisge folklore, transmitted with careful attention to detail, because these signs could mean the difference between life and death. The most consistent and widely documented detection method involved examining the horse's hoofprints when visible. The Each-Uisge, according to tradition maintained across multiple regions, left hoofprints that were reversed or inverted compared to those of natural horses. Where a real horse's prints would show the toe pointing forward in the direction of travel, the Each-Uisge's prints pointed backward, as if the creature had been walking in reverse, or as if its hooves were attached incorrectly to its legs. This reversal was understood to be an unavoidable tell, a crack in the creature's otherwise perfect disguise that revealed its supernatural to those who knew to look for it. Parents taught children to examine any unfamiliar horse's tracks before approaching, to crouch down and study the impressions in mud or sand, and to retreat immediately if the prints showed the characteristic reversal. The presence of water plants in the horse's mane or tail provided another crucial detection sign, particularly relevant for horses encountered near but not in water. The Each-Uisge's fundamental aquatic meant that it carried traces of its true environment even when manifesting on land. Its mane might contain strands of waterweed or kelp, tangled among the hair in ways that would not occur naturally for a terrestrial animal. Its coat might have sand or silt clinging to it even on dry days, suggesting recent submersion. The tail might drip water long after leaving the loch or sea, or smell of salt and deep cold, rather than the normal sense of horse sweat and grass. These botanical and material traces were harder to observe from a distance but became obvious upon close inspection, providing a final chance for recognition before the fatal decision to touch. The creature's behavior, when observed carefully, often revealed inconsistencies that marked it as supernatural rather than natural. Real horses have predictable responses to human approach, either comfortable with humans through domestication or skittish and ready to flee if wild or feral. The Each-Uisge displayed neither pattern convincingly. It would stand too still, maintaining perfect immobility for periods longer than any living animal could sustain without fidgeting or adjusting position. It might fail to react to loud noises or sudden movements that would startle a genuine horse. Its breathing, if one listened closely, might be absent or wrong in rhythm, too slow or too regular to match the pattern of a large mammal at rest. These behavioral anomalies required careful observation and familiarity with normal horse behavior to detect, but they provided warnings to those attentive enough to notice. The Each-Uisge's eyes, despite being described as gentle and inviting in their appearance, sometimes betrayed the intelligence and coldness beneath the disguise. Traditional knowledge taught observers to look for a quality in the gaze that was too knowing, too focused, too aware in ways that transcended animal consciousness. Real horses have intelligent eyes, but their intelligence is of a particular type, concerned with immediate environment and social hierarchy, and the basic calculations of safety and food. The Each-Uisge's eyes, according to those who survived close encounters, held a different kind of awareness, a sense of calculation and predatory patience that felt fundamentally wrong when recognized. This sign was the most subjective and therefore the most unreliable, dependent on individual perception and the ability to trust instinct over desire. But it appeared consistently enough in accounts to warrant inclusion in detection teachings. The temperature of the creature's body provided another potential warning sign, though one that required proximity dangerous enough that detection at this stage might come too late. The Each-Uisge's skin, according to tradition, felt cold even on warm days, retaining the temperature of the deep water from which it had emerged. A hand hovered near, but not touching the creature's coat, might feel an emanation of cold, a chill that radiated from the hide in ways that natural horses did not produce. This temperature difference was subtle enough that it might be dismissed as imagination or attributed to environmental factors. But those who had learned to trust such impressions sometimes found them sufficient to trigger retreat before contact occurred. The context and location of the encounter itself could provide crucial detection clues when combined with other signs. A magnificent horse standing alone near deep water, particularly at dawn or dusk, particularly in locations known for Each-Uisge activity, should trigger suspicion regardless of whether other signs were obvious. The combination of beauty, isolation, proximity to danger, and liminal timing created a pattern that traditional knowledge recognized as high risk. Communities taught their members to question good fortune, to ask why such a valuable animal would be unattended and unclaimed, to consider whether apparent opportunity might be carefully constructed trap. This contextual awareness required cultural knowledge and familiarity with local geography and history but it provided a framework for evaluation that could prevent engagement with suspicious situations. The oral tradition also preserved knowledge about seasonal and temporal patterns in Each-Uisge activity. While the creature was understood to be present year-round in its territories, certain times seemed to correlate with increased hunting or greater visibility. Twilight hours, when light was uncertain, and the boundary between day and night created liminal conditions, were considered particularly dangerous times to be near Each-Uisge waters. Some traditions suggested that the creature was more active during certain seasons, though accounts vary on whether spring, summer, or autumn represented peak danger. What remained consistent was the understanding that temporal awareness needed to combine with geographic knowledge to create complete defensive strategy. The challenge of detection lay in the fact that most of these signs required proximity to the Each-Uisge before they became observable, creating a dangerous tension between the need to identify threats and the need to maintain safe distance. The most effective detection strategy combined multiple signs rather than relying on any single indicator, building a case for supernatural identity through accumulated evidence that justified retreat before contact occurred. Highland communities taught that, when in doubt, suspicion should win, that the cost of incorrectly identifying a real horse as an Each-Uisge was merely embarrassment, while the cost of incorrectly identifying an Each-Uisge as a real horse was death. In the vast catalogue of Each-Uisge encounters preserved through Highland oral tradition, successful escapes appear with such rarity that each documented case carries profound significance. These accounts of survival against a predator whose methods were designed to be inescapable reveal the narrow margins between life and death, the combination of knowledge, luck, and decisive action required to break free from the creature's trap. The stories of those who lived to tell of their encounters with the Each-Uisge were treasured not as entertainment, but as case studies in survival, dissected for the lessons they contained and transmitted with careful attention to the specific actions or circumstances that made escape possible when it should have been impossible. One account preserved in the oral traditions of the Western Highlands describes a young man who recognized the Each-Uisges in the critical seconds after his hand made contact with its hide, but before the full adhesive bond could form. He had reached out to stroke the beautiful horse's neck, and the moment his palm touched the gleaming coat, he felt the unnatural coldness and the beginning of adhesion, his skin starting to fuse with the creature's hide. Rather than pulling back, which would have strengthened the bond and sealed his fate, he pushed forward violently, throwing his entire body weight against the horse in an attempt to knock it off balance. The surprise of this aggressive response, so contrary to the typical panic and pulling that characterized most victims' reactions, created a momentary disruption in the Each-Uisge's concentration or control. In that fragment of time, the young man managed to tear his hand free, leaving skin and flesh behind, but escaping with his life and a permanent scar that served as proof of his encounter. Another survival account, this one from the Isle of Mull, involved a woman who encountered the Each-Uisge in human form during an extended courtship similar to the Loch Awe bride story, but with a different outcome. The Each-Uisge man had courted her for weeks, building trust and affection through patient manipulation, and had finally suggested the fateful walk along the shore that would end with her death. But this woman had been raised by a grandmother who was a repository of traditional knowledge, who had filled her childhood with stories and warnings about supernatural dangers. When the Each-Uisge man's behavior shifted at the water's edge, when his eyes changed and his grip on her arm became unnaturally strong, recognition flooded through her with the force of all those childhood warnings suddenly validated. She did not freeze or waste time in disbelief. Instead, she went limp, dropping her full weight suddenly and unexpectedly, a tactic that disrupted the Each-Uisge's planned progression toward the water. In the confusion of that moment, she twisted free and ran inland, screaming for help and refusing to look back despite hearing footsteps or wing beats pursuing her. The Each-Uisge did not follow her far from the water, suggesting that its power or willingness to hunt diminished with distance from its primary element. A particularly instructive escape involved a shepherd who had mounted an Each-Uisge before recognizing its, finding himself in the nightmare scenario of being adhered to the creature's back as it turned toward a nearby loch. The oral tradition emphasizes that this man survived not through strength or struggle, but through the application of specific traditional knowledge that had been passed down in his family. He carried an iron knife, as many Highland men did, and iron was understood to have power over certain supernatural entities. Rather than trying to pry himself free or attack the Each-Uisge directly, he worked the knife under his own leg where it had fused to the horse's side and cut into his own flesh, severing muscle and skin to free himself from the adhesive bond. The pain was described as beyond comprehension, and the injury left him permanently disabled. But he rolled off the Each-Uisge's back before it entered deep water and dragged himself to safety, while the creature continued into the loch without him. His willingness to mutilate himself rather than accept death demonstrated the absolute terror the Each-Uisge inspired and the desperate measures required for escape once the trap had closed. There are fragmentary accounts of collective resistance succeeding where individual struggle failed, suggesting that the Each-Uisge's power had limits when confronted by organized group action. One such story describes a group of fishermen who witnessed an Each-Uisge in human form attempting to drag a victim into the sea. Rather than approaching individually or trying to pull the victim free, they surrounded the creature and attacked it with oars and boat hooks, striking at its head and body with coordinated violence. The sustained assault apparently disrupted whatever supernatural process maintained the adhesive bond, or perhaps simply injured the Each-Uisge severely enough that it released its grip to retreat. The victim survived with significant injuries from both the Each-Uisge's grip and the rescue attempt, but lived when death had seemed certain. This account was repeated in coastal communities as evidence that the Each-Uisge was not entirely invulnerable, that collective action and willingness to fight rather than flee might occasionally succeed. Some escape accounts involve not the victim's actions, but environmental intervention or pure chance. A story from Argyll describes a victim being dragged into a loch when a sudden rockslide or avalanche from the steep shore created such disturbance in the water that the Each-Uisge released its grip and fled deeper, perhaps startled by the unexpected chaos or concerned about being trapped in the churning silt and debris. The victim, though battered by rocks and nearly drowned, managed to reach shore and survived. Another account speaks of a victim whose screams attracted a large dog that attacked the Each-Uisge with such ferocity that the creature abandoned its prey to deal with the animal threat, allowing the victim to escape, while the Each-Uisge killed the dog. These stories of environmental or animal intervention were rare but treasured, because they suggested that the Each-Uisge, despite its power, remained subject to some of the same risks and concerns as natural predators. What unites these rare escape accounts is the presence of factors that disrupted the Each-Uisge's normal hunting pattern. Unexpected aggression instead of panic, traditional knowledge applied at the critical moment, collective action rather than individual struggle, environmental chaos, or animal intervention. None of the escapes resulted from simple strength or determination alone. The Each-Uisge's trap was designed to neutralize those advantages, making escape dependent on disruption of the expected pattern or exploitation of the creature's few vulnerabilities. These survival stories were studied and retold because they provided the only practical hope of escape once an encounter had begun. The slim possibilities that might be recognized and applied in the desperate seconds between trap closure and final submersion into the cold depths where no rescue was possible. To understand the Each-Uisge fully, we must move beyond cataloguing its characteristics and behaviors to examine why this particular legend existed, what function it served in the communities that preserved and transmitted it across generations. The Each-Uisge was not merely a story told for entertainment or a superstition maintained through ignorance. It was a sophisticated cultural technology, a narrative system designed to encode survival knowledge, enforce behavioral boundaries, and provide psychological frameworks for processing the very real dangers that water posed to Highland and island communities. The terror the Each-Uisge inspired was not incidental, but essential to its function, because only genuine fear could reliably modify behavior in ways that protected lives. The most obvious and immediate function of Each-Uisge lore was water safety education for children. Highland lochs and coastal waters were profoundly dangerous, capable of killing through drowning, hypothermia, or underwater hazards that were invisible from the surface. Children, naturally curious and often unaware of danger until experiencing it directly, needed to internalize caution about water at ages when abstract warnings about temperature and depth would be meaningless or easily forgotten. The Each-Uisge provided a concrete, memorable embodiment of water danger that children could understand and remember. The creature was beautiful but deadly, inviting but fatal, and its method of killing through adhesion and drowning mapped directly onto the real dangers of cold water and undertows that could grip a person and pull them under with shocking speed. By teaching children about the Each-Uisge, parents and elders encoded complex safety information in narrative form that was both engaging and terrifying enough to be retained. The story taught that beautiful things near water could be dangerous, that approaching unfamiliar sources without caution was risky, that playing alone near deep water could end in death, and that once certain thresholds were crossed, rescue might be impossible. These lessons addressed real behavioral risks that claimed children's lives in communities where supervision was difficult and water was omnipresent. The Each-Uisge transformed abstract danger into a concrete entity that children could visualize, fear, and therefore avoid. The Each-Uisge also functioned as a cultural mechanism for processing and explaining the tragedy of unexplained drownings. In communities without modern forensic capabilities or understanding of water dynamics, the disappearance of a person in or near water often left families with no clear explanation of what had happened or how to prevent similar tragedies. The Each-Uisge provided a framework for understanding these losses, a narrative that explained why someone had drowned even when circumstances seemed puzzling, or when the victim was known to be a strong swimmer or cautious person. The creature's intelligence and predatory cunning meant that no one was safe through strength or knowledge alone, that even the careful could be deceived by perfect disguises, and that death by water was not necessarily the result of carelessness or ignorance, but could strike anyone who encountered the Each-Uisge at the wrong moment. This explanatory function also served to alleviate some of the guilt and blame that might otherwise attach to drowning deaths. When a child disappeared in a loch, the community could frame the tragedy as an encounter with the Each-Uisge, rather than as parental negligence or the child's disobedience. When an adult drowned under mysterious circumstances, the Each-Uisge provided an explanation that preserved the victim's reputation and spared the family from suggestions that poor judgment or foolish risk-taking had caused the death. This psychological cushioning did not eliminate grief, but it provided a narrative structure that made the loss somewhat more bearable by framing it as supernatural predation rather than human failure. The Each-Uisge's multiple forms and sophisticated hunting strategies served another cultural function by encoding knowledge about different types of danger and deception. The horse form taught wariness of the obviously attractive and valuable, the lesson that opportunities that seem too good to be true usually are. The human form taught that even people who seem trustworthy and appealing might have hidden agendas, that extended courtship and apparent affection could be masks for predatory intent, and that isolation with strangers near water was dangerous regardless of how safe the person seemed. These were practical lessons about human predators as well as supernatural ones, warnings that helped young people recognize manipulation and avoid situations where they might be vulnerable to assault or abduction. The geographic specificity of Each-Uisge lore, the way certain lochs and coastal areas acquired reputations for danger, served to create mental maps of risk that guided behavior across generations. By associating specific locations with Each-Uisge activity, communities encoded accumulated knowledge about where drownings had occurred, which waters had dangerous characteristics like sudden depth changes or strong undertows, and which areas should be avoided or approached with maximum caution. This geographic encoding was more effective than abstract warnings because it attached danger to specific, memorable places that people could identify and respect throughout their lives. The Each-Uisge's absolute lethality, the near impossibility of escape once its trap closed, served to reinforce the importance of prevention over response. In modern safety culture, we often emphasize rescue techniques and emergency responses. But Highland communities understood that in their environment, with their technology and resources, prevention was the only reliable strategy. The Each-Uisge taught that certain boundaries must never be crossed, that certain risks must never be taken, because there would be no second chances if judgment failed. This emphasis on prevention over rescue was pragmatic given the realities of Highland life, where help was often distant and water cold enough to kill in minutes. The Each-Uisge also functioned as social control, particularly regarding romantic and sexual behavior. The stories of seduction and betrayal, especially those involving women lured by handsome strangers, served as warnings about the dangers of unsupervised courtship and the risks of allowing emotion to override caution. In a culture where pregnancy outside marriage carried severe social and economic consequences, and where women who disappeared might have been victims of violence rather than supernatural predation, the Each-Uisge stories provided a framework for discussing these dangers in ways that were memorable and emotionally impactful. The creature embodied the worst possible outcome of letting desire override judgment, of trusting beautiful strangers, of going to isolated places with people whose intentions might not be what they seemed. Ultimately, the Each-Uisge served as what anthropologists might call a boundary maintenance mechanism, a cultural tool for defining and enforcing the limits of safe behavior in an environment where numerous dangers existed and where mistakes could be fatal. The creature lived at the boundary between land and water, between human and supernatural, between safety and death, and its stories taught people to respect those boundaries absolutely. The terror it inspired was proportional to the very real dangers it represented, and its persistence across centuries testified to its effectiveness in encoding and transmitting survival knowledge through generations of Highland and Island communities. The 19th and 20th centuries brought transformations to Highland and Island Scotland that fundamentally altered how communities related to their landscape, their traditions, and their belief systems. The Each-Uisge which had been treated as present danger rather than historical curiosity for countless generations, began its slow transition from living belief to cultural memory, from immediate threat to folklore artifact. This decline was neither sudden nor complete, and understanding how and why it occurred reveals much about the relationship between modernity, traditional knowledge, and the supernatural beliefs that once governed behavior in ways that kept people alive in dangerous environments. The arrival of widespread literacy and formal education in the Highlands represented one of the most significant factors in the decline of Each-Uisge belief. Schools established throughout the region in the 18th and 19th centuries, often by religious organizations or government initiatives, taught curricula that emphasized rational thinking, scientific explanation, and skepticism towards supernatural claims. Children who had grown up hearing Each-Uisge stories from parents and grandparents now also heard from teachers that such beliefs were superstitions, remnants of an ignorant past that educated people should reject. This created cognitive dissonance and generational conflict, with younger people increasingly embarrassed by beliefs their elders still maintained, viewing traditional knowledge as backward rather than valuable. The introduction of improved water safety measures and rescue capabilities reduced the practical necessity of Each-Uisge law as survival technology. As communities gained access to boats, ropes, and organized rescue services, as swimming instruction became more common, and as understanding of hypothermia and drowning improved, the immediate connection between Each-Uisge warnings and actual survival weakened. Children could now be taught water safety through scientific explanation and practical instruction, rather than through terrifying stories of adhesive horses. The Each-Uisge's function as pedagogical tool became redundant, and without that practical purpose to sustain transmission, the stories began to lose their urgency and authority. The depopulation of the Highlands through clearances, emigration, and economic collapse devastated the oral tradition networks that had maintained Each-Uisge law, communities that had preserved specific local knowledge about dangerous lochs and the creatures that inhabited them were scattered or destroyed, their accumulated wisdom lost when the people who carried it were forced from their ancestral lands. The survivors who remained or who relocated to urban areas found themselves in contexts where Each-Uisge stories were either unknown or actively mocked, creating pressure to abandon or downplay beliefs that mark them as rural, primitive, or foolish. The social and economic destruction of Highland culture had countless consequences, and the erosion of Each-Uisge belief was among the less visible but nonetheless significant losses. The shift from Gaelic to English as the dominant language in most of Scotland also contributed to the decline. The Each-Uisge existed most powerfully in Gaelic, where its name carried weight and where the stories were told in a language that maintained intimate connection to landscape and tradition. When stories were translated into English, something essential was lost in the transition. The name became a pronunciation challenge rather than a word heavy with meaning. The narratives lost their poetic power and cultural resonance, becoming quaint folktales rather than warnings that demanded respect. Younger generations who spoke primarily English found the Each-Uisge remote and abstract, a story from another culture rather than knowledge embedded in their own experience and language. The influence of Christianity, particularly in its more evangelical and rationalist forms, worked actively to suppress Each-Uisge belief along with other elements of Highland folk religion and supernatural tradition. Ministers and missionaries who sought to convert or reform Highland communities often portrayed belief in water horses as pagan superstition, incompatible with Christian faith. They offered alternative explanations for drownings, emphasized God's sovereignty over natural events, and encouraged converts to reject the old beliefs as spiritually dangerous. Some communities internalized these messages and consciously chose to abandon Each-Uisge lore as part of religious conversion, though others maintained a complex syncretism that accommodated both Christian faith and traditional beliefs about the supernatural world. Yet the decline of belief was never absolute or uniform. Remote communities, particularly in the Outer Hebrides and in isolated glens of the mainland Highlands, maintained Each-Uisge traditions well into the 20th century, with levels of belief that range from complete conviction to respectful agnosticism. Elders who remembered the old ways continued to tell the stories, to warn children about beautiful horses near water, and to interpret drownings through the lens of Each-Uisge lore, even as younger people rolled their eyes, or explained the same events through accidental causes. These holdouts preserved the tradition in diminished but recognizable form, creating a bridge between the era of lived belief and the modern period of cultural heritage. The folklorists and anthropologists who began collecting Highland traditions in the 19th and early 20th centuries played a paradoxical role in the decline of belief. By recording Each-Uisge stories for academic study and popular publication, they preserved details that might otherwise have been lost and brought wider attention to Highland mythology. But the act of collection and documentation also transformed the stories, removing them from their original context of belief and practice, and repositioning them as objects of study, examples of primitive thought, or entertainment for outsiders. The Each-Uisge became a specimen in the Museum of Folklore, rather than a living presence in the landscape, preserved, but also fossilized, documented, but also diminished. By the mid-20th century, Each-Uisge belief had largely collapsed among most segments of Highland and Island society, surviving primarily among the elderly and in the most remote communities. The beautiful horse no longer inspired terror but nostalgia, not caution but curiosity. The stories were still told, but increasingly as cultural heritage rather than practical warning, as history rather than present reality. The lochs and seas that had once been understood as Each-Uisge territory were now just water, dangerous still, but in ways that could be explained through and managed through modern safety practices. The Each-Uisge had not disappeared, but it had been transformed, shifted from the realm of belief into the realm of memory, where it would remain as testament to a worldview that modernity had displaced but could never entirely erase. The Each-Uisge exists today in a state of complex duality, simultaneously absent as lived belief and present as cultural artifact, forgotten by mainstream consciousness, yet preserved by those who maintain connection to Highland and Gaelic traditions. The creature's contemporary existence takes forms that would be unrecognizable to the communities that once feared it as immediate danger. Yet these modern manifestations carry forward something essential from the original tradition, adapted to contexts where water horses no longer inspire terror but curiosity, nostalgia, or commercial opportunity. To understand the Each-Uisge's place in the 21st century is to examine how folklore transforms when belief collapses, but memory persists, when stories lose their practical function, but retain their cultural significance. In Scottish tourism, the Each-Uisge has been domesticated and commodified in ways that strip away its original terror while capitalizing on its exotic appeal. Visitor centres in the Highlands and Islands now feature Each-Uisge displays alongside information about geology, history, and wildlife, presenting the creature as colourful local legend rather than danger that once shaped behaviour and claimed lives. Tour companies offer Each-Uisge themed experiences, taking tourists to lochs associated with the creature's lore and retelling the stories in ways that emphasize entertainment over education or authentic transmission. Gift shops sell Each-Uisge merchandise, plush toys and postcards that transform the deadly predator into cute mascot, neutering its power in service of commercial appeal. This touristic appropriation generates economic value, but at the cost of trivializing tradition, reducing complex cultural knowledge to consumable novelty. Yet parallel to this commercialization, serious preservation efforts continue among cultural organizations, Gaelic language advocates, and communities committed to maintaining authentic connection to Highland traditions. These groups document Each-Uisge stories through oral history projects, recording elderly speakers who remember the tales from their own elders, preserving pronunciation and narrative details that might otherwise vanish with the passing of the last generation to receive direct transmission. They publish collections and create educational materials that treat Each-Uisge lore with respect rather than condescension, recognizing its value as cultural heritage and its significance in understanding how Highland communities related to their landscape and managed risk in harsh environments. This preservation work resists both the complete erasure of forgetting and the distortion of commercialization, seeking middle ground where tradition can be maintained with integrity even in absence of belief. The Each-Uisge has also found new life in contemporary Scottish literature and creative arts, where writers and artists draw on the tradition to explore themes of danger, seduction, and the relationship between humans and landscape. These creative reinterpretations range from faithful retellings that honor the original lore to radical reimaginings that use the Each-Uisge as metaphor for contemporary concerns. Some authors position the creature in historical fiction, using it to evoke atmosphere and cultural authenticity in novels set in Highland past. Others transplant it to modern settings, exploring what an ancient predator might become in a world of climate change and environmental destruction. Still, others use the Each-Uisge symbolically, as representation of psychological dangers or social predation, maintaining its essential as beautiful trap, while updating the context to speak to present-day audiences. The academic study of Each-Uisge lore continues in folklore departments and Celtic studies programs, where scholars analyze the creature's place in broader patterns of water spirit mythology, examine its function in Highland society, and trace how belief systems evolve and decline. This scholarly attention preserves the tradition in another form, documenting variants and analyzing meanings, creating archives that ensure future generations will have access to Each-Uisge knowledge, even if living tradition completely disappears. The academic approach brings rigor and comparative perspective, but also removes the stories from their original context of belief and practice, transforming them into data rather than lived experience. This transformation is both necessary for preservation and somewhat tragic in its implications, acknowledging that the Each-Uisge can be studied precisely because it is no longer feared. In Scottish Gaelic language revitalisation efforts, Each-Uisge stories serve pedagogical functions for language learners seeking cultural as well as linguistic knowledge. Language courses include Each-Uisge tales as reading materials or discussion topics, using the creature's name and stories to teach vocabulary and grammar, while also transmitting cultural content. This educational role represents a curious reversal, where the Each-Uisge that once taught children to fear water now teaches adults to speak Gaelic, serving pedagogical purpose in both contexts, but addressing completely different needs. The language revitalisation movement recognizes that Gaelic cannot be separated from the culture it expresses, and preserving Each-Uisge lore becomes part of preserving linguistic heritage, even when supernatural belief has vanished. Some contemporary Highland residents maintain ambiguous relationships with Each-Uisge tradition, neither fully believing nor entirely dismissing, occupying psychological space between rationalist rejection and traditional acceptance. They might not believe a supernatural horse inhabits the local loch, but they still feel uneasy near certain waters at twilight, still experience the echo of childhood warnings when they see unexplained movement on still surfaces. They tell Each-Uisge stories to their own children, framing them as cultural heritage rather than literal truth, but perhaps hoping that the stories will still teach caution about water, even without supernatural threat to give them force. This ambiguous transmission maintains tradition in weakened form, preserving narrative and some emotional resonance while acknowledging that the worldview that made the Each-Uisge real has largely collapsed. The internet age has created new contexts for Each-Uisge lore, with websites, forums, and social media spreading the stories beyond their original geographic and cultural boundaries. People worldwide now encounter the Each-Uisge through online research, videos, or fantasy literature, often with no connection to Scotland or Celtic culture. This global dissemination expands the creature's reach, but also risks distortion, as details are misunderstood or deliberately altered to fit other narrative contexts. The Each-Uisge becomes part of a global folklore commons, mixing with other water spirit traditions and losing some of its specific Highland character in the process. Yet this digital preservation also ensures that the tradition survives in some form, accessible to anyone with internet connection and curiosity about the supernatural beings that once governed behaviour in Scotland's most beautiful and dangerous waters. The Each-Uisge today exist in fragments and echoes, in tourist attractions and academic papers, in children's books and language lessons, in the uneasy feelings that still surface when standing at the edge of deep water in Highland twilight. It is no longer the terror it once was, no longer the immediate danger that shaped generations of survival strategy. But it persists, transformed and diminished, yet still recognizable, still carrying forward something essential about how humans relate to water, to beauty, and to the boundaries between safety and death that must be respected regardless of whether supernatural predators enforce them. We have journeyed together through the cold waters and darker legends of Scotland's most lethal supernatural predator, traced the Each-Uisge from its adhesive trap to its cultural function, from the terror it inspired to the memory it has become. But before we part ways at the edge of this particular loch, before we turn away from the mirror-still surface and return to the safer territories of modern life, we must ask what the Each-Uisge ultimately means, what truth it carries forward across the centuries, and why some legends deserve to be remembered with respect rather than dismissed as primitive superstition or quaint folklore. The Each-Uisge is more than a story about a monster. It is a story about how humans have always related to the beautiful, dangerous world we inhabit, and about the wisdom encoded in warnings we can no longer afford to forget. The Each-Uisge represents humanity's eternal recognition that beauty and danger are not opposites, but often intimate companions, that the most lethal threats frequently arrive wearing attractive disguises, and that our own desires can be weaponized against us by forces that understand our vulnerabilities with predatory precision. This truth transcends the supernatural context in which the Each-Uisge was originally embedded. We may no longer believe in adhesive horses that drag victims into lochs, but we still encounter seductions that promise more than they deliver, relationships that reveal their true only after commitment has been made, opportunities that seem miraculous until the trap closes. The Each-Uisge's fundamental lesson about the necessity of caution in the face of perfection remains relevant, regardless of whether water spirits actually exist. The creature also embodies a deeper truth about the relationship between humans and the natural world, particularly water in its most dangerous forms. Highland lochs and seas killed regularly throughout the centuries, claiming lives through drowning, hypothermia, and underwater hazards that were invisible until too late. The Each-Uisge did not create these dangers, but personified them, gave them intelligence and intention, transformed impersonal environmental threat into an entity that could be understood, feared, and potentially avoided through proper behavior. This personification was not ignorance, but sophisticated risk management, a way of encoding survival knowledge in memorable narrative form that could be transmitted across generations and internalized by children before they had the cognitive capacity to understand abstract warnings about temperature and depth. The Each-Uisge tradition also reminds us that folklore serves functions beyond entertainment, that stories maintained across centuries often carry practical wisdom earned through accumulated tragedy. Modern societies tend to dismiss traditional knowledge as superstition, to assume that scientific understanding has made such beliefs obsolete. But this dismissal often overlooks the sophisticated ways that folklore encoded and transmitted information about danger, about social relationships, about the boundaries that must be respected for survival. The Each-Uisge warned about water safety, about the risks of isolation with strangers, about the necessity of heeding cultural knowledge even when it conflicted with immediate desire. These warnings remain valuable even in contexts where the specific supernatural threat has been explained away. There is something profound in the fact that the Each-Uisge's victims understood their fate, that the adhesive bond allowed full consciousness of what was happening as they were dragged into the depths. This is not the quick death of predators that kill with a bite to the neck, not the merciful unconsciousness of drowning in panic. This is prolonged awareness, the horror of knowing exactly what is happening and being completely unable to prevent it, of watching safety recede as death approaches with measured inevitability. This element of conscious dying speaks to deeper fears about control and agency, about the moments when we realize that our choices have led us into situations from which there is no escape, when we see the outcome approaching and can do nothing but experience it. The Each-Uisge's method of killing is a metaphor for any trap that closes slowly enough for understanding, but firmly enough to preclude escape. The persistence of Each-Uisge memory, even after belief has collapsed, suggests that some stories touch something so fundamental in human experience that they resist complete erasure. We remember the Each-Uisge not because we fear encountering it, but because it represents patterns we still recognize, truths we still need to acknowledge about beauty and danger, about the limits of human control, about the wisdom embedded in caution. The lochs where the Each-Uisge once hunted are still there, still deep, still cold, still capable of killing those who underestimate them. The creature may be gone from belief, but the dangers it personified remain, and the lessons it taught about respecting those dangers retain their value. As we conclude this exploration, as we step back from the water's edge and allow the Each-Uisge to return to the depths where it has always dwelt, we should recognize that the divide between belief and skepticism, between traditional knowledge and modern understanding, is less absolute than we often assume. The people who believed in the Each-Uisge were not fools or primitives, but pragmatic survivors in harsh environments, using the cognitive tools available to them to encode and transmit knowledge that protected lives. Their belief was not opposed to practical wisdom, but a vehicle for it, a way of making danger memorable and behavioral boundaries enforceable. We, who no longer believe, have not necessarily become wiser, only different. And perhaps we have lost as much as we have gained in the transition from a world where water spirits demanded respect to one where warning signs attempt the same function with less emotional force. The deep water remembers. It remembers every life it has claimed, every moment of panic and cold, every victim who struggled and sank into darkness. The Each-Uisge was the name Highland communities gave to that memory, the personification of accumulated loss and hard-won knowledge about survival at the boundaries between safety and death. The creature no longer haunts the lochs in the old way, no longer appears as a beautiful horse waiting to trap the unwary, but it persists in story and symbol, in the caution we feel near deep water at twilight, in the recognition that some boundaries exist for reasons written in tragedy and should be respected regardless of whether supernatural enforcement still applies. The Each-Uisge lives wherever beauty masks danger, wherever desire overcomes caution, wherever water waits with patient hunger for those who forget that respect is the price of survival. If this journey into Scotland's darkest water has spoken to you, if these explorations of folklore and human have resonated, I invite you to subscribe to Echoes of the Old World. We will continue together into other forgotten corners of mythology, other stories that shaped cultures and encoded wisdom in narrative form, other legends that deserve to be remembered not as entertainment, but as testament to how humans have always navigated the beautiful, dangerous world that surrounds us. The Each-Uisge waits still in the deep places, and there are many more such waitings to explore. Many more echoes of the old world that carry messages the modern world needs to hear.